Welcome to Quiet Law YouTube channel. Find yourself a comfortable place to rest. Let the weight of the day begin to fall away from your shoulders, your mind, your body. There's nothing you need to do right now. Nothing to solve, nothing to remember, nothing to plan. Just this moment, this quiet space, and a gentle journey through time. Tonight, we're going to travel together through the story of human ingenuity. Not with urgency or excitement, but slowly, peacefully, like watching clouds drift across an ancient sky. We'll trace the path of 100 inventions that changed our world, but we'll do it softly, letting each discovery wash over us like a gentle wave. These inventions span thousands of years, from the first flicker of flame in a prehistoric cave to the technologies that fill our modern lives. But more than just machines and tools, they represent something deeper, something human. They represent curiosity, problem-solving, the quiet determination to make life a little easier, a little safer, a little more wonderful. So breathe deeply. Let your eyes grow heavy if they wish. And let's begin at the very beginning, when our ancestors first learned to shape the world around them, one small discovery at a time. Long before cities rose from the earth, before roads connected distant lands, before the written word captured human thought, there was darkness. And in that darkness, our earliest ancestors huddled together, vulnerable to the cold, to predators, to the vast and frightening unknown. They ate their food raw, slept when the sun dictated, and lived at the mercy of nature's rhythms. Then came fire. Perhaps it was a lightning strike that set a tree ablaze. Perhaps it was the friction of stones or sticks rubbed together in desperation or curiosity. However it happened, the discovery of fire, and more importantly, the ability to control it, changed everything. For hundreds of thousands of years before this moment, humans had observed fire from a distance, feared it, fled from it. But once they learned to create it, to tend it, to keep it alive, they possessed something no other creature had. They could cook their food, making it safer to eat and easier to digest. They could warm themselves through brutal winters. They could keep dangerous animals at bay with a ring of flame. They could extend their productive hours beyond sunset, gathering around the glow to share stories, strengthen bonds, and pass knowledge from one generation to the next. Fire was light. Fire was warmth. Fire was protection. Fire was the beginning of human civilization, a tool so fundamental that every society that followed would build upon its transformative power. And with survival more assured, humans could turn their attention to another pressing need: consistent nourishment. For millennia, they had been hunters and gatherers, constantly moving, constantly searching for the next meal. But as populations grew and favored hunting grounds became depleted, the need for reliable food sources became critical. Enter the noodle. Now, you might smile at this, the humble noodle appearing so early in our story. But consider what it represents. The noodle, dating back at least 4,000 years, is one of humanity's earliest processed foods. Before noodles, grains were consumed as whole seeds, ground into simple porridges, or baked into crude flatbreads. The process was inefficient, the nutritional extraction incomplete. But noodles, those simple strands of dough made from wheat or rice flour mixed with water, changed the equation. They were easier to cook evenly, easier to digest, easier to preserve, and easier to portion. They could be dried and stored for months, making them perfect for travel or for surviving harsh seasons. The noodle represented something profound: the beginning of food technology, the idea that humans could transform raw ingredients into something more useful, more efficient, more sustaining. Across Asia, across the Middle East, and eventually across the world, variations of this simple invention would feed billions, turning basic grains into a form that could power civilizations. But food from farming required water, and water didn't always flow where it was needed most. Fields lay parched while rivers rushed past, frustratingly out of reach. For centuries, humans had carried water by hand, bucket by bucket, an exhausting and inefficient process that limited what they could grow and where they could settle. Then, in the 3rd century before the Common Era, a brilliant mind named Archimedes observed a simple principle and created an elegant solution. The Archimedes screw is a device of beautiful simplicity, a helical surface wrapped around a shaft, enclosed in a tube. When the bottom end is placed in water and the shaft is turned, the rotating screw lifts water upward, seemingly defying gravity. Before this invention, irrigating fields above the water level meant endless human labor, chains of workers passing containers hand to hand, or elaborate and fragile systems of pulleys and buckets. The Archimedes screw changed everything. It was efficient, reliable, and could be operated by a single person or even by an animal. Fields that once lay barren could now be cultivated. Settlements could be established in locations previously thought impossible. And perhaps most importantly, the screw demonstrated a principle that would echo through millennia. That understanding nature's laws allows us to work with them, not against them, to bend the world gently to our needs. With water solved, the next challenge was the earth itself. Early agriculture was brutally difficult. Humans used pointed sticks and crude hoes to break the soil, scratching at the surface, disturbing only the topmost layer. It was backbreaking work that yielded modest results. Fields were small because the labor required was so immense. The plow changed this equation forever. Emerging around 6,000 years ago, the plow was initially a simple wooden frame pulled by oxen or other draft animals. Unlike a stick or hoe wielded by human hands, the plow could cut deep furrows into the earth, turning over soil, burying weeds, and preparing large areas for planting in a fraction of the time. Before the plow, a family might cultivate only enough land to feed themselves. With the plow, they could work fields large enough to produce surplus, and surplus meant everything. It meant some people could specialize in crafts instead of farming. It meant the beginnings of trade. It meant settlements could grow into villages, villages into towns. The plow didn't just make farming easier, it made civilization possible, freeing humanity from the constant scramble for subsistence and allowing culture, art, and innovation to flourish. Yet even with plows and irrigation, farmers faced a persistent problem: exhausted soil. After a few seasons of intensive planting, fields would produce less and less, the nutrients depleted, the earth tired. The obvious solution was to let land rest, but this meant leaving half or more of your fields fallow at any time. A terrible waste when populations were growing and food was always needed. The three-field system, developed in medieval Europe around the 8th century, was an elegant answer to this problem. Before this system, farmers typically used a two-field rotation, half planted, half resting. But the three-field system divided land into thirds. One field would be planted with winter crops like wheat or rye, another with spring crops like oats or barley, and the third would lie fallow to recover. Each year, the crops would rotate. This simple reorganization had profound effects. It increased productive land use from 50% to 67%. It distributed labor more evenly across seasons, preventing the desperate crunches of planting and harvest. It provided variety in diet and options if one crop failed. And it kept soil healthier by alternating the nutrients different crops consumed. The three-field system didn't require new technology or expensive tools, just a new way of thinking about time and land. It was agricultural wisdom, peasant knowledge refined over generations, and it helped feed medieval Europe through centuries of growth and change. But rotating crops meant nothing if your animals couldn't pull the plow efficiently. For centuries, draft animals wore simple throat and girth harnesses that pressed against their windpipes when they pulled. The harder they worked, the harder it became to breathe. Horses, especially, were barely used for plowing because the harness design choked them. Oxen, slower but more tolerant of poor harnesses, did most of the heavy work. The horse collar, developed in China and later refined in medieval Europe, solved this problem with elegant simplicity. Instead of a strap across the throat, the horse collar was a padded frame that rested on the horse's shoulders, distributing the load across the animal's chest and eliminating pressure on the windpipe. Suddenly, horses could pull with their full strength, and horses were faster than oxen, more versatile, more responsive. With proper collars, horses could plow fields in half the time, haul heavier loads, cover greater distances. This wasn't a small improvement. It was a multiplication of agricultural capacity. Fields could be worked more quickly, crops could reach market faster, and horses became the engines of medieval economies. A simple redesign of where force was applied transformed what animals could do for human society. Still, even with better tools and techniques, farmers remained at the mercy of soil quality. Some lands were naturally rich and produced abundant harvests. Others were poor, thin, depleted. For most of human history, there was little to be done about this except to move on and find better ground. Fertilizer, in its earliest forms, changed this calculus. Humans had long observed that fields where animals grazed seemed more productive, and that plants grew vigorously in areas where organic matter decomposed. Manure, compost, fish remains. These became the first deliberate fertilizers, carefully applied to boost yields. Before this understanding, farmers simply accepted that some land was good and some was not. But with fertilizer, they could improve what they had, transform mediocre soil into productive earth. It was the beginning of the idea that nature was not fixed, that with knowledge and effort, humans could enhance and direct natural processes. Fields that had been abandoned could be reclaimed. Harvests could be increased without expanding farmland. And the cycle of nutrients, from plant to animal to soil and back to plant, became something humans could consciously manage and optimize. Yet traditional fertilizers, organic and locally sourced, had limits. There was only so much manure available, only so much compost. As populations exploded in the 19th century, the demand for food soared beyond what traditional farming could provide. Scientists searched desperately for ways to amplify soil nutrients on an industrial scale. Superphosphate fertilizer, developed in the 1840s, was the breakthrough. Before this, farmers had used ground bones as a phosphorus source, but the process was slow and the supply limited. An English entrepreneur named John Laws discovered that treating phosphate rock with sulfuric acid created a compound that plants could absorb far more readily. For the first time, phosphorus, one of the essential nutrients for plant growth, could be manufactured in bulk, transported anywhere, and applied systematically. Fields across the world saw yields increase dramatically. Crops that once struggled in phosphorus-poor soil now thrived. Superphosphate fertilizer represented the industrialization of agriculture, the moment when farming began to rely not just on the land's natural gifts, but on human chemistry and manufacturing. It was a preview of the 20th century to come, when science would increasingly reshape how humans fed themselves. But phosphorus was only part of the puzzle. Nitrogen, even more critical for plant growth, remained stubbornly difficult to supply. Plants need nitrogen to build proteins, but nitrogen gas, though abundant in the atmosphere, is chemically inert, unusable by most organisms. Before the 20th century, farmers relied on natural sources. Manure, crop rotation with legumes that could fix atmospheric nitrogen, or expensive imports of nitrate-rich guano from distant islands. It was never enough. Scientists warned of impending global famine as populations outstripped the nitrogen supply. Then came the Haber process, perfected in the early 20th century by German chemists Fritz Haber and Carl Bosch. This process, a variant of which is still used today, synthesizes ammonia by combining atmospheric nitrogen with hydrogen under high pressure and temperature, using a catalyst to speed the reaction. For the first time in history, humans could pull nitrogen from the air and convert it into fertilizer on an industrial scale. The impact was staggering. Global food production soared. Population growth, which might have been checked by starvation, instead accelerated. Today, it's estimated that half the nitrogen in your body came from the Haber process. It's no exaggeration to say this invention, more than almost any other, made the modern world possible. It allowed billions of people to be fed. It also brought complications, environmental costs we're still grappling with. But in that moment, it was nothing less than a way to manufacture food from thin air. With the land enriched and cultivation improving, humans needed power, sustainable power that didn't depend solely on the muscles of people or animals. For centuries, the only options were human labor, animal labor, or the occasional, unpredictable power of flowing water. The windmill, developed around the 7th century in Persia and later spreading across Europe, captured something previously untouchable: the wind. Before windmills, the wind was just weather, something to endure or enjoy, but not something to use. The windmill changed that. Its great sails caught the breeze and converted that motion into rotational force that could grind grain, pump water, saw wood, or press oil. In flat, windy regions like the Netherlands, windmills became the engines of prosperity, draining marshes, grinding grain for growing populations, powering industries. They were elegant, tireless, requiring no fuel except the ever-present wind. They represented humanity's growing understanding that energy existed all around, waiting to be captured and directed. And they dotted the landscape like sentinels, slowly turning, patiently working, markers of a world learning to harness nature's invisible forces. But wind was fickle, unreliable, sometimes absent for days. Water, by contrast, flowed with consistency. The water wheel, particularly the reverse overshot design, became one of the most reliable power sources of the ancient and medieval world. In its simplest form, water wheels had been used for centuries, with flowing rivers turning paddles attached to a shaft. But the reverse overshot wheel was more sophisticated. Water was channeled from above, filling buckets on the wheel's upper edge. The weight of the filled buckets pulled the wheel around, combining the force of falling water with gravity's pull. This design was more efficient, more powerful, and could operate in locations where fast-flowing rivers weren't available. Before water wheels, every task requiring sustained force, grinding grain, sawing lumber, fulling cloth, had to be done by hand or by animal. Water wheels changed this, providing continuous, powerful mechanical motion. Mills sprang up along rivers across Europe and Asia, humming and clattering day and night, transforming raw materials into finished goods, laying the foundation for industrial economies still centuries away. The power from water wheels could be multiplied through clever mechanisms. One of these was the trip hammer, a device that converted the steady rotation of a water wheel into the rhythmic pounding of heavy hammers. Before trip hammers, metalworking, particularly forging iron, was limited by human strength and endurance. A blacksmith could only strike so many times so hard before exhaustion set in. The trip hammer, driven by water power, could pound tirelessly, shaping metal, crushing or fulling cloth with a force and consistency no human could match. Developed in ancient China and later adopted across the world, trip hammers meant that metalwork could scale up. Swords, tools, nails, all the metal goods a civilization needed, could be produced more quickly and uniformly. The trip hammer was automation before the word existed, a machine doing work humans once did, freeing them for other tasks, multiplying productivity. With all this activity, with growing settlements and expanding agriculture, humans needed to control water more precisely. Rivers flooded unpredictably, destroying crops and homes. Streams dried up in summer, leaving fields parched. What was needed was storage, a way to hold water back when it was abundant and release it when it was scarce. The arch dam, engineered brilliantly by Roman engineers and refined over centuries, solved this problem. Earlier dams were simple earthen barriers or straight walls of stone, but they were limited in height and strength, always at risk of collapse under the immense pressure of stored water. The arch dam, curving upstream, directed water pressure into the canyon walls on either side, using the force of the water itself to strengthen the structure. It was an elegant application of geometry and physics. Before arch dams, large-scale water storage was nearly impossible. With them, humans could create reservoirs, ensuring year-round water supply, controlling floods, and generating consistent water power for mills. Arch dams transformed landscapes, turning arid regions into productive lands, protecting valleys from seasonal deluges. They represented a new relationship with nature, not simply adapting to water's movements, but managing, containing, and redirecting it for human purposes. And once water was captured, it needed to be transported, sometimes across vast distances. Cities grew in locations chosen for defensibility or trade, not always near clean water sources. How could a city of thousands, or tens of thousands, survive without reliable water? The aqueduct, perfected by Roman engineers, was the answer. These magnificent structures, some spanning miles, carried water from distant springs and rivers to urban centers, using gravity and precise gradients to maintain flow. Before aqueducts, cities were limited by local water sources. Populations were constrained. Sanitation was poor. But with aqueducts, cities could grow beyond their natural limits. Fresh water flowed into public fountains, baths, and homes. Sewage could be flushed away. Public health improved dramatically. The aqueduct was more than infrastructure. It was a statement of ambition and capability. It said, "We can bring water from the mountains to the city. We can engineer on a monumental scale. We can make civilization work in places nature didn't intend." And so, from fire to flowing water, from the first scratch in the soil to the great aqueducts spanning valleys, humanity had transformed itself. No longer entirely at the mercy of nature, no longer simply surviving, humans had learned to settle, to farm, to build, to harness the elements themselves. These inventions, born of necessity and refined through generations, laid the foundation for everything that followed. Rest now. Let these images drift through your mind. Fire crackling in the darkness. Water flowing uphill through a clever screw. Fields stretching to the horizon, turned by plow and horse. And know that this is only the beginning of our journey together through time. With survival assured and settlements established, humanity turned its gaze outward and upward. Food could be grown, water could be moved, but the world was still vast and difficult to traverse. Materials were limited, construction was crude, and the ambition to build beyond simple shelters remained constrained by what human hands could fashion from stone and wood. What came next was a revolution in materials and methods, inventions that would allow humans not just to survive in the world, but to reshape it entirely. Consider the wheel. It seems so obvious now, so fundamental, that it's difficult to imagine a world without it. Yet for most of human existence, there were no wheels. Heavy objects were dragged on sledges, pulled across logs that rolled beneath them, or carried on the backs of humans and animals. Moving anything substantial required enormous effort. A stone block for a monument might take dozens of people weeks to transport just a few miles. Trade over long distances was nearly impossible for anything but the most valuable, lightest goods. The wheel, invented around 5,500 years ago in Mesopotamia, changed everything about movement. A simple disc rotating on an axle seems almost too basic to be revolutionary. Yet it was. With wheels attached to carts, suddenly one ox could pull what previously required 10 men to drag. Goods could travel hundreds of miles instead of just a few. Trade networks expanded. Ideas and innovations spread faster. Armies could move supplies that sustained longer campaigns. The wheel wasn't just about transportation. It was about connection, about linking distant places and peoples in ways that had never been possible. And beyond transport, the wheel became fundamental to countless other technologies. The potter's wheel for shaping clay, the spinning wheel for making thread, gears and pulleys and mechanisms of every kind. The wheel was, in many ways, the first universal tool, adaptable to nearly any task that required rotation or rolling. It was so transformative that societies without wheels, even advanced ones, remained fundamentally limited in what they could achieve. But movement alone wasn't enough. Humans also needed to build, to construct structures that would last, that would protect and shelter and inspire. For thousands of years, buildings were held together by friction, by weight, by careful stacking of stones, or by lashing timbers with rope and leather. These methods worked, after a fashion, but they were limited. Structures were small, prone to shifting and collapse, requiring constant maintenance. The nail, particularly once it could be manufactured in quantity from iron, transformed construction. Before nails, joining would require elaborate carpentry, mortise and tenon joints, wooden pegs, intricate dovetails. These techniques were time-consuming, required great skill, and limited how quickly structures could be built. The nail was brutally simple, a sharp metal spike driven through one piece of wood into another, holding them together with friction and the wood's own grip on the metal. With nails, a moderately skilled carpenter could build in hours what might have taken days with traditional joinery. Frames could be lighter yet stronger. Repairs became simpler. Buildings could go up faster, and that speed meant growing cities could house expanding populations. The humble nail, mass-produced by the thousands and then millions, was the hidden fastener holding the built world together, so common we barely notice it, yet so essential that construction, as we know it, would be impossible without it. As humans built more and moved more, they also rode. Horses had been domesticated for millennia, used for pulling carts and plows, but riding them was uncomfortable and inefficient. Early riders simply sat on the horse's bare back, or threw a cloth or hide across it. This was precarious, exhausting for long journeys, and limited how effectively a rider could control the animal or perform tasks while mounted. The saddle, developed gradually across many cultures, solved these problems with elegant practicality. A proper saddle, with its tree or frame, distributed the rider's weight across the horse's back, preventing injury to the animal and providing a stable platform for the rider. Padding made long journeys bearable. Straps kept it secure. Before saddles, riding was something done briefly, for short distances, more novelty than practical transportation. With saddles, riders could travel all day, covering distances that would take days or weeks on foot. Messages could be carried swiftly across empires. Herders could manage vast flocks. And perhaps most significantly, mounted warriors became far more effective, able to fight from horseback with some stability, though still limited in what they could do. That limitation was solved by one of history's most consequential small inventions, the stirrup. Before stirrups, riders gripped the horse with their legs, maintaining balance through constant tension and adjustment. Fighting from horseback meant one hand held reins while the other wielded a weapon, and any significant impact, striking with a sword or throwing a spear, risked unseating the rider. Cavalry existed, but it was constrained, used mostly for scouting or harassing, not decisive combat. The stirrup, developed in Asia and spreading westward by the early medieval period, was simply a loop hanging from each side of the saddle where the rider could place their feet. This tiny addition changed warfare forever. With feet braced in stirrups, a rider could stand, could turn, could strike with full force without falling. The stirrup transformed the horse and rider into a single, stable fighting platform. Knights in armor became possible, charging with lances, the stirrup allowing them to brace for impact and transfer the horse's momentum into a devastating strike. The stirrup made cavalry dominant on battlefields for centuries. It shifted political power toward those who could afford horses and equipment. It changed the structure of societies, all from a simple loop of metal or leather that let a rider plant their feet. With mobility mastered, humans turned their attention to the materials from which they built their world. For ages, bronze had been the strongest metal available, made by combining copper and tin. Bronze was harder than copper alone, could hold an edge, could be cast into tools and weapons and art. But bronze had limitations. The metals required were not always available. Bronze was expensive, and it simply wasn't strong enough for many applications humans could envision. Cast iron changed the equation. Iron itself had been known for millennia, smelted in small quantities in forges, laboriously hammered into shape. But cast iron, created by melting iron in furnaces hot enough to liquefy it completely, allowing it to be poured into molds, was different. Developed in ancient China and later rediscovered in medieval Europe, cast iron could be produced in much larger quantities than wrought iron. It was harder, though more brittle. It could be shaped into complex forms: pots, tools, structural elements, eventually cannons and machinery parts. Before cast iron, metal was precious, used sparingly. With cast iron, metal became a building material, something you could make a bridge from, or the frame of a building. It was heavier than bronze, less elegant perhaps, but it was abundant and strong, and it made the industrial age possible. Blast furnaces roared, producing tons of cast iron, and that iron became the skeleton of the modern world. Yet cast iron had its flaws. It was brittle, prone to cracking under stress, unsuitable for applications requiring flexibility or impact resistance. What was needed was steel, iron with just the right amount of carbon, combined with other elements, to create a metal that was both strong and flexible, that could bend without breaking, that could hold a razor edge or support immense loads. Steel had been made in small quantities for centuries, laboriously refined by skilled smiths. But it was rare and expensive, reserved for the finest swords and most critical tools. The breakthrough came in the mid-19th century with the Bessemer process, which allowed steel to be mass-produced by blowing air through molten iron, burning away impurities rapidly and cheaply. Suddenly steel was affordable. It could be made by the ton, by the trainload, and steel changed everything it touched. Rails made of steel lasted far longer than iron. Steel beams could support buildings dozens of stories tall. Steel cables held up suspension bridges, spanning distances that had been impossible. Ships could be larger, stronger, safer. Tools could be more precise and durable. Steel was the material that built the skylines of modern cities, that connected continents by rail, that made the Industrial Revolution fully possible. But even early steelmaking processes had limitations in quality and consistency. Different batches might have different properties, unpredictable flaws, varying carbon content that affected strength and workability. The Siemens-Martin process, also known as the open hearth process, developed in the 1860s, refined steel production further. This method used regenerative furnaces that recycled waste heat to reach extremely high temperatures, and it could process both pig iron and scrap steel together, controlling chemistry more precisely. Before this, steel making was somewhat haphazard, with smiths relying on experience and intuition to judge when the metal was right. The Siemens-Martin process brought scientific control. Steel could be analyzed, adjusted, produced to exact specifications. It could be made in larger batches with consistent quality. For decades, this process produced the majority of the world's steel, the steel that built railroads across continents, warships that ruled the seas, and skyscrapers that redefined urban landscapes. It represented the maturation of metallurgy from craft to science, from art to engineering. With strong metals available, humans could build larger structures, but they still needed a material for foundations, for walls, for holding together the bones of steel and stone. Wood rotted. Stone was expensive to quarry and shape. Brick was limited in scale. Concrete, particularly the hydraulic concrete perfected by the Romans, and then largely lost before being rediscovered in the modern era, was the answer. Ancient peoples had used mud and clay mixtures, but these dissolved in water and cracked with weather. Roman concrete, made from volcanic ash, lime, and aggregate, could set underwater and harden into stone-like solidity over time. The Romans built the Pantheon, the Colosseum, aqueducts and harbors with this remarkable material. Then, after the fall of Rome, the knowledge was largely forgotten, and for 1,000 years, builders struggled with inferior materials. The rediscovery and improvement of concrete in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly Portland cement, which could be manufactured consistently and set predictably, unleashed a construction revolution. Concrete could be poured into any shape, could be reinforced with steel to combine strength in compression with strength in tension, could be made locally from common materials, and was far cheaper than stone. Before modern concrete, buildings were limited by how high stone could be stacked or how much weight wood could bear. With reinforced concrete, buildings could soar, bridges could span vast distances, dams could hold back entire rivers. Concrete became the most used construction material in human history, quite literally the foundation of the modern built environment. Roads, buildings, infrastructure of every kind, all rest on concrete, that humble mixture of cement, sand, gravel, and water that hardens into artificial stone. Yet as humans built more, they also needed to see more clearly, to protect themselves from the elements while still letting in light. For most of history, windows were either open holes in walls, closed with shutters, or covered with thin sheets of horn-oiled cloth, or very expensive, crude glass made by laborious methods. Glass existed, but making flat panes large enough for windows was extraordinarily difficult and expensive. Only the wealthiest could afford glass windows, and even those were often small, thick, wavy, and imperfect. Glassblowing, invented in the 1st century before the Common Era, likely in the Roman-controlled Eastern Mediterranean, revolutionized glass production. Before glassblowing, glass was shaped by molding, by winding molten glass around a core, or by casting, all slow and limited methods. Glassblowing used a hollow tube to inflate molten glass like a bubble, which could then be shaped, blown into molds, or flattened into sheets. Suddenly glass could be made much faster, in larger pieces, more uniformly. Glass vessels became common, not just treasures for the rich. Windows became more affordable, and glass, transparent yet protective, became the material that let humans create enclosed spaces filled with light. Over centuries, glassblowing techniques improved, leading to clearer, flatter panes, to lenses for spectacles and microscopes and telescopes, to glass as both functional material and artistic medium. It opened up new ways of seeing and new possibilities for architecture. As construction became more sophisticated, as buildings grew larger and projects more complex, builders faced a new challenge: communication. How could an architect's vision be conveyed precisely to builders? How could complex mechanical devices be reproduced exactly? For centuries, plans were drawn by hand, but copying them meant redrawing, with each copy slightly different, errors creeping in, details lost or misunderstood. The blueprint, developed in the mid-19th century, solved this problem elegantly. The process used light-sensitive chemicals on paper. A drawing made on translucent paper was placed over blueprint paper and exposed to light. Where the drawing blocked light, the chemicals remained light-colored. Where light passed through, they turned deep blue. The result was a white-lined copy of the drawing on a blue background, hence blueprint. Before blueprints, only a few hand-drawn copies of plans could exist, making coordination on large projects extremely difficult. With blueprints, an architect could create a master drawing and produce dozens or hundreds of identical copies quickly and cheaply. Every worker on a construction site could have the same accurate plans. Changes could be copied and distributed. Complex projects involving thousands of parts, intricate machinery, skyscrapers with hundreds of rooms. These became manageable because everyone was literally working from the same blueprint. It was the standardization of technical communication, making possible the vast, coordinated construction projects that define the modern world. And as buildings rose higher, made possible by steel frames and concrete, a new problem emerged. Buildings of 5 or 6 stories were feasible, but climbing stairs beyond that was exhausting. The upper floors of tall buildings were the least desirable, the cheapest, because reaching them required such effort. This limited how tall buildings could practically be, even when structurally they could go much higher. The safety elevator, invented by Elisha Otis in 1853, removed this final barrier. Elevators had existed before, simple platforms on ropes pulled by horses or steam engines, but they were dangerous. If the rope broke, the platform plummeted, killing anyone aboard. This had happened enough times that people were rightly terrified of early elevators, and they were used only for freight, never passengers. Otis's innovation was breathtakingly simple: a safety mechanism that would catch the platform if the rope failed. Spring-loaded bars would shoot out and grip the guide rails, stopping the fall. Otis famously demonstrated this at the New York World's Fair, riding a platform high above the crowd and then having an assistant cut the rope with an axe. The platform dropped a few inches, the safety mechanism engaged, and Otis stood calmly, alive, the crowd astonished. Suddenly elevators were safe. Passengers would ride them. And suddenly the top floors of buildings became the most desirable, offering views and prestige without the exhaustion of stairs. The safety elevator made the skyscraper possible, made vertical cities practical, made urban density achievable without sprawl. Cities could build up instead of only out, and the skylines we recognize today, mountains of steel and glass and concrete rising into the clouds, all depend on that simple safety mechanism that catches you if you fall. From the wheel that moved us forward to the elevator that lifted us upward, from cast iron's strength to concrete's versatility, from the nail that held wood together to the blueprint that aligned human vision, these inventions built the physical world we inhabit. They transformed humans from creatures who sheltered in caves and huts into builders of cities, creators of spaces that reached toward the sky, engineers who could shape the very landscape to their needs and dreams. Rest easy now. Feel the solid ground beneath you, built up over millennia of human ingenuity. The wheel turning, the nail holding, the elevator rising smoothly and safely. And know that our journey continues, that there is so much more to discover together as you drift peacefully towards sleep. With the world built and materials mastered, humanity faced a more abstract challenge, one that could not be solved with stronger metals or taller buildings. This was the challenge of precision, of measurement, of truly understanding the invisible forces and principles that govern the universe. To advance further, humans needed to see smaller, to measure more accurately, to capture and control forces they could barely perceive. They needed, above all, to master time itself. For most of human history, time was imprecise, felt rather than measured. The sun rose and set. Seasons changed. Water dripped through clepsydras. Sand trickled through hourglasses. Candles burned down marked intervals. These were adequate for agricultural societies, for knowing roughly when to plant or when to pray, but they were crude, inconsistent, impossible to rely on for anything requiring real precision. You couldn't coordinate complex activities across distances. You couldn't measure how long processes took with any accuracy. Scientific experiments were difficult to reproduce because time itself couldn't be measured consistently. The mechanical clock, emerging in medieval Europe around the 13th century, changed everything about humanity's relationship with time. These first mechanical clocks used a simple but ingenious mechanism, an escapement. This device allowed a weighted mechanism to release energy in controlled, regular intervals, advancing gears that moved hands around a dial. Tick-tock, tick-tock, each movement measured, each second or minute identical to the last. Before mechanical clocks, time flowed loosely, approximately. With mechanical clocks, time became standardized, quantified, something that could be agreed upon. Church bells could ring at precisely the same moment each day. Workers could begin and end labor at appointed times. Markets could open and close by schedule. Society itself became more coordinated, more synchronized, moving to the rhythm of clockwork rather than the vague passage of sun and shadow. The mechanical clock didn't just measure time. It created a new kind of time, abstract and uniform, the time that would eventually govern every aspect of modern life. Yet even early mechanical clocks were imperfect, drifting by minutes each day, influenced by temperature, by wear, by inconsistencies in their mechanisms. For everyday life this was acceptable, but for science, for navigation, for understanding the heavens, something more precise was needed. The pendulum clock, perfected by the Dutch scientist Christian Huygens in 1656, brought a new level of accuracy. Galileo had observed that pendulums swing at regular intervals regardless of the arc's width, a property called isochronism. Huygens harnessed this principle, using a pendulum to regulate the clock's escapement. The pendulum's steady swing, governed by gravity and the length of the pendulum itself, provided a natural, consistent rhythm far more reliable than the mechanisms of earlier clocks. Before pendulum clocks, a good clock might be accurate to within 15 minutes a day. With a pendulum, accuracy improved to within seconds per day, later even fractions of a second. This precision transformed science. Experiments could be timed accurately, allowing researchers to study motion, to test theories, to measure phenomena that happened in split seconds. Astronomers could time celestial events precisely, improving their understanding of planetary movements. And in daily life, people could trust the time, could coordinate with unprecedented accuracy. The pendulum clock made the world more punctual, more synchronized, more precisely measured. This precision became absolutely critical when humans ventured onto the open ocean, beyond sight of land. Sailors had long known how to determine their latitude, their north-south position, by measuring the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon. But longitude, their east-west position, was far more difficult. Longitude required knowing the exact time at a reference location and comparing it to local time determined by the sun's position. The difference in times revealed how far east or west you had traveled. But clocks of the era couldn't maintain accuracy on ships. The motion of the waves, changes in temperature and humidity, all threw them off. Ships would sail for weeks with only approximate knowledge of their east-west position, often discovering they were hundreds of miles off course, running aground, missing their destinations, wrecking on unseen shores. The marine chronometer, perfected by John Harrison in the 18th century after decades of obsessive work, solved this deadly problem. Harrison created timepieces that could maintain accuracy to within seconds over months-long voyages despite temperature changes, despite the constant motion of a ship, despite salt air and dampness. His chronometers used innovative mechanisms: bimetallic strips that compensated for temperature changes, special escapements that resisted the effects of motion, sealed cases that protected delicate parts. Before the marine chronometer, ocean navigation was part skill and part dangerous guesswork. With it, ships could determine their position with confidence, could chart accurate maps, could cross oceans and arrive precisely where they intended. The chronometer made global navigation reliable, made trade routes safer, made exploration more systematic. It connected the world in a way that had never been possible, quite literally putting every location on Earth onto an accurate map. The chronometer was precision made portable, time made trustworthy even in the wildest conditions. As humanity learned to measure time with ever greater precision, they also sought to see more clearly, to perceive what was too small or too distant for the naked eye. For all of human history, people had been limited by their own senses, able to see only what their eyes could resolve, missing entire worlds that existed just beyond the threshold of visibility. The magnifying glass, refined through centuries but made practical with improved glassmaking, opened up these hidden worlds. A simple curved lens, thicker in the middle than at the edges, bends light in a way that makes objects appear larger. Before magnifying lenses, craftspeople worked by feel and experience, unable to see fine details in their work. Scribes strained to read damaged texts. The elderly lost the ability to read as their eyes weakened. But with magnifying glasses, suddenly details emerged. Jewelers could examine tiny flaws in gems. Scholars could read ancient, faded manuscripts. Naturalists could study insects, plant structures, the intricate architecture of nature's smallest creations. The magnifying glass was humanity's first step beyond the limits of human vision, the beginning of the realization that entire universes existed at scales we couldn't naturally perceive. It made the invisible visible, and in doing so, expanded what humans could know and understand about their world. But small things on Earth were only part of what remained hidden. The heavens held even greater mysteries. Ancient astronomers had mapped the stars with naked eyes, tracked planets, predicted eclipses, but they saw only the brightest objects, only the coarsest details. The universe beyond seemed forever out of reach. The reflecting telescope, pioneered by Isaac Newton in the 17th century, brought the distant cosmos within human grasp. Earlier telescopes used lenses to gather and focus light, but lenses had problems. They were heavy, difficult to make large, and suffered from chromatic aberration, where different colors of light focused at different points, creating blurry, rainbow-edged images. Newton's reflecting telescope used a curved mirror instead of a lens to gather light. Mirrors could be made larger more easily, didn't suffer from chromatic aberration, and could collect far more light than a lens of similar size. With reflecting telescopes, astronomers could see fainter stars, could observe details on planets, could eventually peer into the depths of space and discover galaxies beyond our own. Before the reflecting telescope, the universe was a ceiling of lights, beautiful but mysterious, mostly unchanging. With it, The universe became a place, vast beyond comprehension, filled with objects to study, patterns to discover, laws to understand. The reflecting telescope didn't just let humans see farther. It revealed that the universe was far stranger and more magnificent than anyone had imagined. It was the tool that would eventually show us our true place in the cosmos, tiny but capable of understanding, small but able to see across billions of light years. Yet to truly understand nature, humans needed to do more than observe. They needed to experiment, to isolate phenomena, to create conditions that didn't exist naturally so they could study how things behaved. One of the most important conditions to create was nothing itself, the vacuum. The vacuum pump, developed by Otto von Guericke in the 17th century, allowed scientists to remove air from sealed containers, creating spaces where air was absent or greatly reduced. Before vacuum pumps, people weren't even certain that a vacuum could exist. Aristotle had claimed nature abhorred a vacuum, but Guericke's pump could evacuate air from a sphere, and when he demonstrated it, the force of atmospheric pressure held the two halves of his sphere together so strongly that teams of horses couldn't pull them apart. This was revolutionary. It proved air had weight, had pressure, was a physical substance, not just empty space. The vacuum pump became an essential scientific tool. Researchers could study how things behaved without air, how sound couldn't travel through vacuum, how flames couldn't burn, how objects fell at the same rate regardless of weight when air resistance was removed. The vacuum pump opened up an entire realm of experimentation, allowing the study of air pressure, of gases, of the fundamental properties of matter and energy. It was the tool that made modern physics possible, that allowed humanity to ask, what happens when we take away the air we've breathed all our lives and never really noticed? And as scientists experimented with vacuums and air, they also began to explore a mysterious force they'd observed since ancient times, but never understood: electricity. Lightning was terrifying and inexplicable. Rubbing certain materials together created strange attractions, tiny sparks, but these seemed like curiosities, parlor tricks, nothing useful or controllable. The Leyden jar, invented independently by two researchers in the 1740s, was the first practical way to store electricity. It was remarkably simple: a glass jar coated inside and out with metal foil, with a metal rod extending through a cork into the jar. When connected to a static electricity generator, the jar would accumulate and store electrical charge. Before the Leyden jar, electricity was fleeting, a momentary spark that appeared and vanished. With the Leyden jar, electricity could be captured, held, studied at leisure, discharged at will. Researchers could perform experiments, could pass stored electricity through different materials, could begin to understand what this mysterious force actually was. The Leyden jar was the ancestor of every battery, every capacitor, every device that stores electrical energy. It was the moment electricity became something humans could possess and control, not just witness and fear. It was the first step toward the electrical age that would transform everything. But electricity wasn't the only mysterious force humans were beginning to understand. Heat and motion had always been connected. Fire made things move, friction made things hot, but no one truly understood why or how these were related. For centuries, heat was thought to be a substance, a fluid called caloric that flowed from hot objects to cold ones. The eolipile, invented by Hero of Alexandria in the 1st century, was a device far ahead of its time that demonstrated a profound principle. Heat could be converted into motion. The eolipile was a sphere mounted on an axis with two curved tubes projecting from it. Water was boiled beneath the sphere, and steam rose into it. The steam then escaped through the curved tubes, and the force of the steam jetting out caused the sphere to spin, rotating faster and faster as more steam was generated. It was, in essence, the first steam turbine, the first reaction engine, the first demonstration that heat energy could be converted into mechanical work. Yet in Hero's time, it was considered a mere toy, a curiosity. There was no framework to understand its significance, no technology to harness it, no industrial need for mechanical power beyond what slaves and animals could provide. The Eolipile remained a forgotten wonder for nearly 2,000 years. But the principle it demonstrated, that expanding gas could push and create motion, would eventually become the foundation of the steam age, of engines that would power factories and locomotives and ships. The Eolipile was humanity's first glimpse of a future where fire didn't just warm and illuminate, but drove machines, where heat became power. And that future finally arrived with the piston engine, the heart of the Industrial Revolution. For thousands of years, human and animal muscle, supplemented by wind and water, were the only sources of power. But these were limited, inconsistent, tied to specific locations. What was needed was a portable, controllable source of power that could work anywhere, anytime, producing as much force as needed for as long as fuel was available. The piston engine, developed through the 18th century by inventors like Thomas Newcomen and James Watt, made this possible. Steam, generated by burning coal or wood to boil water, was fed into a cylinder where it pushed a piston. As the piston moved, it could drive machinery, pumps to drain mines, hammers to forge metal, looms to weave cloth, eventually wheels to propel locomotives and ships. Before the piston engine, industry was constrained by geography. Mills had to be built by rivers for water power. Winds were unreliable. But with piston engines, factories could be built anywhere. Mines could be dug deeper because flooding could be controlled. Production could scale up enormously because power was no longer limited. The piston engine was the muscle of industrialization, tireless, powerful, capable of doing the work of hundreds of horses, of thousands of people, day and night without rest. It transformed manufacturing, transportation, mining, agriculture. It created a new kind of economy, one based on machine power rather than human labor. And it changed the relationship between humans and energy forever. No longer were people dependent only on what their bodies or domesticated animals could provide. They could harness heat itself, could burn fuel and transform it into motion, could multiply their strength 1,000-fold. From the ticking of the first mechanical clock to the rhythmic pounding of piston engines, from magnifying glasses that revealed hidden details to telescopes that pierced the depths of space, from vacuum pumps that created nothingness to Leyden jars that captured lightning. These inventions marked humanity's transformation from observers to experimenters, from passive recipients of nature's mysteries to active investigators who could measure, control, and harness the fundamental forces of reality. Time was no longer something that simply passed, but something that could be divided, measured, trusted. The very small and very distant were no longer forever hidden, but could be studied and understood. Forces like electricity and steam power, once fearsome or ignored, became tools, servants to human will and human need. Rest now in this moment of understanding. Feel time flowing steadily, reliably, each second identical to the last. Know that human curiosity has pierced both the infinite distance of space and the infinitesimal world beneath our notice. And let yourself drift peacefully, knowing our journey through innovation continues ever onward. Humanity had learned to build, to measure, to harness natural forces, but something essential was still missing. Knowledge existed in individual minds, passed down through spoken stories, preserved laboriously by scribes who copied manuscripts by hand. Ideas spread slowly, at the pace of walking or sailing, carried by travelers who might distort or forget what they'd learned. Each generation had to relearn much of what the previous generation knew. Human progress was constrained not by what people could discover, but by how poorly they could share those discoveries with each other and with the future. What came next was perhaps the most transformative revolution of all. The ability to capture thought itself, to freeze ideas in physical form, to send knowledge across distance and time without the fragility of human memory. This was the revolution of communication, and it would accelerate human progress beyond anything that had come before. Consider paper. For thousands of years, humans had written on whatever surfaces they could find. Clay tablets, heavy and fragile, that shattered if dropped. Stone, permanent but impossible to transport in quantity. Papyrus, made from Egyptian reeds, useful but brittle and expensive. Animal skins, processed into parchment or vellum. Durable, but requiring entire herds to produce enough for a single library. Writing surfaces were so precious that knowledge itself became precious, hoarded, accessible only to the wealthy and powerful. Books were treasures, each one representing months or years of labor by skilled scribes. Paper, invented in China around the 1st century and refined over centuries before spreading westward, changed this equation forever. Made from pulped plant fibers, rags, or wood, paper was lightweight, flexible, and could be produced in enormous quantities relatively cheaply. Before paper, a single book might cost as much as a farm. With paper, books became affordable, not common yet, but attainable. Knowledge could be recorded more freely. Letters could be written by ordinary people, not just nobles and merchants. Paper was the medium that made mass communication physically possible. The surface on which the written word could finally escape the confines of wealth and privilege. It was democratic in a way previous writing surfaces never could be, and it created the possibility that knowledge might one day belong to everyone. But paper alone wasn't enough. Even with an affordable writing surface, books still had to be copied by hand, one at a time, letter by letter, a process so time-consuming that a single scribe might spend an entire year copying a single lengthy manuscript. Errors crept in. Scribes grew tired, misread words, skipped lines. Each copy was slightly different from the original. Rare books existed in only a handful of copies, sometimes only one, so that if fire or war or simple decay destroyed them, the knowledge they contained vanished forever. Learning was bottlenecked by the slow speed of human hands. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, shattered this bottleneck with revolutionary force. Gutenberg's insight was to use movable type, individual letters cast in metal that could be arranged into words, sentences, pages, then rearranged for the next page. Combined with a press adapted from winemaking, this system could produce hundreds of identical copies of a page in the time it took a scribe to copy it once by hand. Before the printing press, there were perhaps 30,000 books in all of Europe, each one precious and rare. 50 years after Gutenberg, there were 12 million books. Knowledge exploded outward. The Bible became affordable to common people, eroding the church's monopoly on scripture. Scientific discoveries could be shared widely, allowing researchers across Europe to build on each other's work instead of unknowingly repeating it. Revolutionary ideas, political pamphlets, novels, newspapers, all became possible. The printing press didn't just make books cheaper. It made ideas dangerous, uncontrollable, impossible to suppress. It made the Renaissance possible, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment. Every intellectual movement that followed was built on the foundation of the printing press, on the sudden ability of humans to share ideas faster than they could be stopped. It was perhaps the single most democratizing invention in history, the tool that began the long process of making knowledge available to anyone who could read. And with more people reading and writing, with ideas spreading faster, a new need emerged, the need to write quickly. For business, for journalism, for the growing bureaucracies of modern states, handwriting was too slow. A trained scribe might write 20 or 30 words per minute, carefully forming each letter. But commerce and government generated paperwork faster than human hands could produce it. Documents piled up, letters went unanswered, records fell behind. The typewriter, perfected in the late 19th century after many earlier attempts, multiplied the speed of writing. Keys, each connected to a metal arm with a raised letter, would strike an inked ribbon against paper when pressed, creating clear, uniform text. A trained typist could write 60, 80, even 100 words per minute, and every word was legible, identical in form, professional. Before typewriters, business correspondence was handwritten, difficult to read, limited by the writer's penmanship and stamina. With typewriters, offices could process far more paperwork. Carbon paper allowed multiple copies to be made simultaneously. Women entered the workforce in large numbers as typists, gaining economic independence. The typewriter standardized written communication, made it faster, made it more democratic since anyone could produce professional-looking documents regardless of their handwriting. And it changed how people thought about writing itself. The permanence of typed words, the inability to easily revise without retyping, shaped how carefully people composed their thoughts. The typewriter was the bridge between the handwritten past and the digital future, the first machine that turned thought into uniform, mechanical text. But even with printing presses and typewriters accelerating the production of written material, information still moved only as fast as paper could be transported, which meant it moved at the speed of horses, trains, or ships. News from across an ocean might arrive weeks or months after the events occurred. Urgent messages could take days to reach their destination. Distance still constrained communication, still limited how quickly humans could coordinate, react, and respond to events beyond their immediate vicinity. The printing telegraph, and specifically the system developed by inventors like Samuel Morse in the 1830s and 40s, collapsed distance in a way that seemed almost magical. The telegraph used electrical pulses sent through wires to transmit coded messages, with operators translating Morse code, patterns of short and long signals, into letters and words. A message that would take days by horseback could arrive in minutes by telegraph. Before the telegraph, information traveled at the speed of physical transportation. With the telegraph, information traveled at the speed of light through copper wires. This was the first time in all of human history that communication was separated from transportation, that a message could arrive faster than any messenger could carry it. The implications were staggering. Businesses could coordinate across continents. Newspapers could report breaking news from distant cities the same day it happened. Governments could manage far-flung territories with unprecedented efficiency. The telegraph wired the world together, creating for the first time a truly global communication network. And it changed human consciousness, making distant events feel immediate, collapsing the psychological distance between places. The world became smaller, more connected, more knowable. Yet the telegraph required wires, infrastructure that was expensive to build and limited to where cables could be laid. Oceans could be crossed with underwater cables, but remote areas remained cut off. Ships at sea were isolated, unable to call for help or report their position. What was needed was a way to communicate without wires, to send messages through the air itself. Radio, developed in the late 19th century by inventors including Guglielmo Marconi, made this impossible dream a reality. Radio uses electromagnetic waves, invisible ripples in the electromagnetic field that travel through air, through water, even through the vacuum of space. By encoding information into these waves through modulation, varying their amplitude or frequency, voices, music, and data could be transmitted without any physical connection between sender and receiver. Before radio, communication required some physical link, a wire, a piece of paper, a messenger. Radio freed communication completely. Ships at sea could call for help, preventing countless deaths when the Titanic sank, its distress calls bringing rescue ships that saved hundreds of lives. Remote communities could receive news and entertainment. During emergencies, when wires were cut or infrastructure destroyed, radio still worked. And radio brought something new to human experience. Broadcasting, the ability for one transmitter to reach millions of receivers simultaneously. Information and culture could be shared instantly with vast populations. Radio created mass media, shared experiences, a sense of connection across distances that would have been unimaginable just decades earlier. The invisible waves carrying voices through the air seemed like magic, and in a sense they were. The closest humans had come to the telepathy they'd imagined in myths and stories. While communication technologies advanced, humanity also developed new ways to capture reality itself, to freeze moments in time with perfect accuracy. For all of human history, the only way to record what something looked like was to draw or paint it, processes that required skill, time, and subjective interpretation. An artist might capture the essence of a scene, but never with complete accuracy, never without their own perspective altering the result. Photography, pioneered in the early 19th century by inventors like Louis Daguerre and William Henry Fox Talbot, changed this fundamentally. Photography used light-sensitive chemicals on metal plates or paper to capture images formed by light passing through a lens. The camera saw exactly what was there, recording details no artist could match, preserving moments with absolute fidelity. Before photography, people never knew exactly what their ancestors looked like. Historical events were documented only through written accounts and artistic interpretations. The faces of ordinary people vanished with their deaths. But with photography, memory became permanent. Loved ones could be remembered as they truly appeared. Historical moments could be witnessed by future generations. Scientific specimens could be documented precisely. Evidence could be preserved for courts. Photography was truth-telling in a way nothing before it had been. A mirror held up to reality that captured and preserved what it reflected. And it was democratic. While early photography was expensive and cumbersome, it became progressively cheaper and simpler, until eventually nearly everyone could afford to preserve their own memories, their own slice of time frozen forever. As commerce and industry expanded, as more goods moved through more complex supply chains, a new problem emerged: identification and tracking. Stores carried thousands of products. Warehouses held tens of thousands of items. Keeping inventory, pricing items, tracking what sold and what remained, this all required enormous amounts of manual labor. Clerks memorized prices or looked them up in catalogs. Checkout was slow, error-prone. Supply chains were opaque, with goods disappearing or being misplaced between factory and store. The barcode, invented in the 1940s, but not widely adopted until the 1970s, solved these problems with elegant simplicity. A barcode is just a pattern of black and white bars of varying widths, encoding numbers that represent product information. A scanner shines light on the barcode and reads the pattern, instantly identifying the product and retrieving its information from a database. Before barcodes, every transaction required human reading and data entry. With barcodes, checkout became fast and accurate. Inventory could be tracked automatically. Supply chains became visible, with goods tracked from manufacture through distribution to final sale. The barcode seems almost trivially simple, just lines on a package, but it was the nervous system of modern commerce, the technology that made large-scale retail, efficient logistics, and just-in-time manufacturing possible. It turned physical objects into data, bridging the physical and digital worlds. And in a world of faster communication and more complex commerce, even simple transactions needed to be reimagined. Buying something had always required a human seller, a shopkeeper, a vendor, someone to exchange goods for money. But what if you needed something when shops were closed, when no one was available to sell to you? The vending machine, first developed for simple items in ancient times, but refined into its modern form in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, automated the act of selling. Insert money, make a selection, receive your product. The machine handles payment, storage, and dispensing without any human involvement. Before vending machines, commerce required people to be present. With them, goods could be sold anywhere, anytime. Snacks in office buildings at midnight. Tickets in train stations when the booth was closed. Drinks on factory floors without stopping work to visit a store. Vending machines extended commerce beyond human limitations, made it available 24 hours a day, reduced labor costs, and provided convenience that would have been impossible otherwise. They were early automation, replacing human transactions with mechanical ones, a preview of the increasingly automated world to come. From paper that made knowledge portable to printing presses that made it abundant, from telegraphs that made communication instant to radio that made it wireless, from photography that captured truth to barcodes that turned objects into data, from typewriters that mechanized writing to vending machines that mechanized selling. These inventions did something profound. They accelerated thought itself. Ideas that once took generations to spread could now circle the globe in hours. Knowledge that once died with individuals could now be preserved forever. Communication that once required physical presence could now happen across any distance instantaneously. Humanity was no longer constrained by the speed of horses or ships, no longer limited to what could be remembered or laboriously copied by hand. Information had been set free, and once freed, it would transform everything it touched. Rest now in this connected world. Imagine the invisible waves of radio surrounding you, carrying voices and music through the air. Picture the countless books printed and shared, the photographs preserving millions of moments, the messages traveling through wires at the speed of light. And let yourself drift peacefully, knowing that we have only begun to explore how deeply these innovations would change what it means to be human. Throughout history, as humanity built and communicated and discovered, another force shaped the world with equal power: conflict. Tribes competed for resources, kingdoms sought to expand, empires rose and fell. And in this endless cycle of competition and warfare, technology played a decisive role. A new weapon, a better defense, a more efficient way to project power. These could shift the balance between nations, determine which cultures would flourish and which would fade into history. What follows are inventions born from humanity's darker impulses, yet they too shape the world we inhabit, for better and worse, in ways both obvious and subtle. For thousands of years, warfare was intimate and exhausting. Soldiers fought with muscle-powered weapons: swords, spears, bows. They had to be close to their enemies, close enough to see their faces, to hear their cries. Armor could protect against these weapons. Castles could withstand sieges for months or years. Warfare was constrained by human strength and endurance, brutal but limited in its destructive potential. Then came gunpowder, discovered in China during the 9th century, perhaps by alchemists seeking immortality, ironically creating instead a substance that would end millions of lives. Gunpowder is a mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal that, when ignited, burns rapidly, producing enormous volumes of hot gas. This violent expansion could propel projectiles with force far beyond what any human muscle could achieve. Before gunpowder, weapons were limited by how hard you could pull a bowstring or swing a sword. With gunpowder, weapons could pierce any armor, could kill from distances that made the enemy a distant figure, not a person. Early gunpowder weapons were crude, dangerous to the user, often as likely to explode as to fire properly. But they improved. Guns became reliable. And as they did, they changed everything about warfare and power. A peasant with a gun could kill a knight in full armor, trained since childhood in combat. Suddenly, years of martial training mattered less than access to gunpowder weapons. Warfare became more democratic in a strange way, and far more deadly. Distance replaced courage as the primary factor in survival. And societies that mastered gunpowder technology gained enormous advantages over those that didn't. Advantages that would shape colonial expansion and global power dynamics for centuries. If handheld gunpowder weapons changed infantry combat, the cannon, developed in the late medieval period, revolutionized siege warfare and changed the very nature of political power. Before cannons, fortified castles and city walls were nearly impregnable. A well-supplied castle could withstand a siege almost indefinitely. This meant power was decentralized. Local lords in their castles could defy kings, could maintain independence, could resist central authority. Cannons shattered this balance, quite literally. These large gunpowder weapons could fire iron or stone balls with devastating force, smashing through walls that had stood for centuries. No castle was safe anymore. No city wall could withstand a sustained bombardment. Before cannons, sieges were long, expensive affairs that might drag on for years. With cannons, walls that had protected cities for generations could fall in days or weeks. This centralized power dramatically. Kings with the wealth to afford cannons and the infrastructure to move them could crush rebellious nobles, could enforce their will across entire kingdoms. The feudal system, built on the military independence of castle-holding lords, began to crumble. Nation-states emerged, centralized governments with monopolies on military power. The cannon didn't just destroy walls. It destroyed a whole political order, replacing decentralized medieval kingdoms with the unified nations that would dominate the modern era. And navies equipped with cannons could project power across oceans, could bombard coastal cities, could enforce colonial control, making European expansion into the Americas, Asia, and Africa far more devastating than it would otherwise have been. Yet, even as gunpowder weapons rose to dominance, one older weapon evolved in ways that extended its relevance for centuries: the crossbow. Bows had been used since prehistoric times, but they required enormous strength and years of training to use effectively. An English longbowman trained from childhood, developing muscles and skills that took decades to master. But crossbows, developed in various forms across different cultures, used a mechanical mechanism to draw and hold the string, storing the energy until the trigger was pulled. This meant almost anyone could use a crossbow effectively with minimal training. Before crossbows, missile weapons required elite specialists. With crossbows, ordinary soldiers could be armed with powerful ranged weapons quickly and cheaply. The crossbow was so effective that it was actually banned by the Pope in 1139 for use against Christians, though this ban was widely ignored. It was seen as unfair, allowing common soldiers to kill noble knights from a distance without risk. And that was precisely its significance. It was another democratizing military technology, reducing the advantage of professional warriors, making armies larger and deadlier. The crossbow also had a psychological impact. It killed silently compared to the thunder of firearms, could be aimed more carefully, and was accurate enough to target specific individuals. Assassinations became easier. Defenses had to be redesigned with the crossbow's power in mind. And while firearms eventually surpassed crossbows, the crossbow's long relevance demonstrated an important principle. Sometimes simpler, quieter, more reliable technology persists alongside newer innovations, each finding its own niche. As firearms improved through the 19th century, military theorists dreamed of weapons that could fire continuously, mowing down attacking forces with sustained volleys. Traditional firearms required loading after each shot. Pour in powder, ram down a ball, aim, fire, repeat. A skilled soldier might fire 3 or 4 shots per minute. This rate of fire limited the defensive power of small units against massed attacks. The Gatling gun, invented by Richard Gatling in 1861, changed this calculus dramatically. It used multiple rotating barrels, each fired in sequence as a hand crank turned, with ammunition fed automatically from a magazine. A single Gatling gun could fire hundreds of rounds per minute, creating a continuous stream of bullets that could devastate advancing infantry. Before the Gatling gun, defensive positions could be overrun by determined attackers willing to accept casualties. With it, small numbers of defenders could hold off vastly larger forces. The Gatling gun made frontal assaults suicidal, forcing changes in military tactics. It also had a dark role in colonial warfare, where technologically superior European forces used Gatling guns and similar weapons to massacre poorly armed indigenous armies, contributing to the devastating efficiency of imperial conquest. The Gatling gun was the ancestor of the machine gun, a weapon that would define the horrific trench warfare of the First World War, where attacking forces were slaughtered by the thousands, pinned down by sustained automatic fire. It represented the industrialization of killing, violence made mechanical, efficient, mass-produced. Yet not all powerful inventions were designed explicitly for war. Dynamite, invented by Alfred Nobel in 1867, was created to solve peaceful problems: mining, construction, clearing land. Before dynamite, explosives were difficult to handle and unpredictable. Nitroglycerin was powerful, but so unstable it could detonate from a slight shock, killing those who transported it. Nobel's innovation was to absorb nitroglycerin into a porous material, creating a stable substance that could be handled safely, but would still explode with tremendous force when detonated properly. Dynamite transformed construction and mining. Tunnels could be blasted through mountains, creating railways that connected distant regions. Mines could be dug deeper and faster, extracting the coal and metal ores that fueled industrialization. Land could be cleared for agriculture and development. Before dynamite, moving earth and rock was backbreaking labor, achieved with pickaxes and wheelbarrows, limited by human muscle. With dynamite, landscapes could be reshaped rapidly. Entire hillsides could be removed. Rivers could be redirected. But dynamite was also quickly adopted for warfare. Explosive artillery shells, naval mines, bombs dropped from early aircraft, demolition charges, all relied on dynamite's stable but devastating power. Nobel, horrified by how his invention was used to kill, established the Nobel Prizes with his fortune, hoping to be remembered for promoting peace rather than enabling destruction. Dynamite demonstrated a recurring pattern in technological history. Inventions created for peaceful purposes are often adapted for war, and the same innovation that builds can also destroy, depending entirely on human choices about how to use it. As weapons became more powerful and conflicts more destructive, warfare itself changed character. The American Civil War and later the First World War saw the rise of static, defensive warfare, where armies dug trenches and faced each other across contested ground. Attacking across open ground was suicidal given modern firearms, but defending required a way to control territory, to mark boundaries, to prevent enemy infiltration without requiring soldiers to stand guard at every point along miles of front. Barbed wire, invented in the 1870s for agricultural purposes to fence cattle cheaply, became one of the defining features of modern warfare. Before barbed wire, fences required either expensive materials or constant maintenance. Barbed wire was cheap, easy to deploy, and incredibly effective. When adapted for military use, it created barriers that soldiers couldn't easily cross. Coiled in dense tangles before defensive positions, barbed wire slowed attacking infantry, forcing them to pause under fire to cut through it, turning them into easy targets. Before barbed wire, defensive lines were only as strong as the soldiers holding them. With barbed wire, relatively few defenders could hold vast stretches of front. No man's land, the devastated ground between opposing trenches in the First World War, was often impassable walls of barbed wire, rusted and tangled, sometimes with the bodies of soldiers caught in it from failed attacks. Barbed wire represented the ultimate defensive technology of its era, simple, cheap, and horrifyingly effective. It turned warfare static, leading to the grinding stalemates that defined early 20th century conflicts, where hundreds of thousands died for gains measured in yards. A technology meant to keep cattle in their pastures became a symbol of modern wars' impersonal brutality. And as warfare industrialized, as chemical weapons were introduced in the First World War, as poisonous gases drifted across battlefields, soldiers needed protection not just from bullets and shrapnel, but from the very air they breathed. Chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas, these weapons attacked the lungs, the eyes, the skin, killing in ways that were agonizing and horrifying. Without protection, soldiers exposed to gas attacks died by the thousands, drowning in fluid filling their own lungs. Respiratory protective equipment, specifically gas masks, became essential for survival. These devices used filters of activated charcoal and other materials to remove toxic chemicals from air before it was breathed. Before gas masks, poison gas attacks could clear trenches, could kill indiscriminately. With gas masks, soldiers could survive in contaminated environments, could continue fighting despite the presence of chemical weapons. Gas masks were uncomfortable, restricting, frightening to wear, with their bug-like eyepieces and breathing filters making soldiers look inhuman. But they saved countless lives. And beyond warfare, respiratory protection became essential for industrial workers exposed to toxic dust and fumes, for firefighters entering smoke-filled buildings, for anyone working in hazardous environments. The gas mask represented humanity's need to protect itself from its own destructive innovations, a defensive technology necessitated by offensive ones, a shield required because someone else had forged a terrible sword. From gunpowder's first explosive burst to gas masks filtering poisoned air, these inventions show technology's double nature. Each innovation provided advantages to those who possessed it, shifted power balances, enabled conquest or defense. Some were created for destruction and achieved it with horrible efficiency. Others were made for peaceful purposes and were twisted to violent ends. All of them shaped which nations rose and fell, which empires expanded and collapsed, which peoples were conquered, and which did the conquering. These inventions remind us that technology itself is neutral, a tool that amplifies human intentions, whether those intentions are noble or terrible. The same ingenuity that builds can destroy. The same creativity that solves problems can create new ones. And the same species capable of such violence is also capable of protecting itself, of limiting destruction, of choosing, sometimes, not to use the most devastating weapons it has created. Rest now, at peace, far from these conflicts. The cannons are silent, the barbed wire rusted and removed, the gas dissipated into history. Let these troubling inventions fade from your mind like smoke clearing, knowing they are part of our story, but not its ending. There is more to discover, gentler innovations ahead, as our journey continues through the long night toward morning. The world had been shaped by human hands and animal strength for thousands of years. Clothing was sewn stitch by stitch. Fields were plowed behind oxen. Goods were crafted one at a time by skilled artisans. Production was slow, limited by how fast fingers could move, how long muscles could work before exhaustion set in. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, something fundamental shifted. Machines began to do the work that hands had always done. Power that had once come from muscle now came from steam, from combustion, from forces humans had learned to capture and control. What followed was a transformation so complete that historians call it a revolution, though it happened not in days but across decades, reshaping everything about how humans lived and worked. We've spoken before of the piston engine, but let us return to the steam engine now, to understand its full impact on this industrial transformation. Early steam engines, like Newcomen's, were massive, inefficient machines used primarily to pump water from mines. They consumed enormous amounts of coal to produce relatively little work. They were stationary, fixed in place, useful only for specific tasks. Then James Watt, in the 1760s and 70s, improved the steam engine's efficiency dramatically by adding a separate condenser, preventing heat loss, and incorporating other refinements. Watt's engines used a fraction of the fuel for the same work, making steam power economically viable for the first time. But more importantly, steam engines could now be built smaller, could be adapted to drive machinery of all kinds. Before Watt's improvements, steam power was a curiosity, limited to a few applications. After, it became the heart of industry. Factories no longer needed to be built beside rivers for water power. They could be located anywhere coal could be delivered. The steam engine was freedom from geography, from the constraints of wind and water. It was reliable, tireless, capable of running day and night without rest. Cotton mills, steel foundries, locomotive trains, steamships crossing oceans, all were powered by steam engines converting heat into motion, transforming the landscape and the economy. The steam engine didn't just replace muscle. It multiplied human capability hundreds of times over, making possible a scale of production that would have been unimaginable in earlier eras. And with steam power available, machines could be built that were themselves impossibly strong, capable of forces no human could match. One such machine was the steam hammer, invented by James Naismith in 1839. Before the steam hammer, the largest metal forgings were limited by what human blacksmiths, or even water-powered trip hammers could shape. Forging large iron and steel components for ships, bridges, and machinery required incredible force, more than existing tools could provide. The steam hammer was a marvel of controlled power. A massive hammer, weighing tons, was raised by steam pressure and then released to fall, its weight multiplied by steam driving it downward. But despite its enormous force, capable of flattening red-hot metal slabs with ease, the steam hammer could be controlled with extraordinary precision. In demonstrations, Naismith would use his steam hammer to crack an egg in a wine glass, the hammer stopping with such delicacy that the glass remained intact. Before the steam hammer, creating large forgings was nearly impossible. With it, enormous ship propeller shafts, railway axles, structural components for bridges and buildings could be shaped and forged. The steam hammer represented the Industrial Revolution's character perfectly. Immense power under precise human control, violence tamed into productivity, the mechanical embodying both brute force and unexpected gentleness. Yet steam power alone wouldn't have transformed society if it couldn't be applied to the work most people did. And in the 18th century, most manufacturing work, especially textile production, was done by hand in homes and small workshops. Making cloth was laboriously slow. First, raw fibers had to be spun into thread, a process done on spinning wheels by hand, one thread at a time. A skilled spinner might work all day and produce only enough thread for a few yards of cloth. The spinning jenny, invented by James Hargreaves in 1764, multiplied a spinner's productivity dramatically. This machine allowed a single operator to spin 8 threads simultaneously. Later versions handled even more. Before the spinning jenny, one person produced 1 thread at a time. With it, one person could do the work of 8 or 16. Suddenly thread became more abundant, prices dropped, and cloth became more affordable. But the spinning jenny was just the beginning. It was a simple machine, operated by hand, still limited by human power and speed. What was needed was something that combined multiple innovations, that could produce even finer, stronger thread in even greater quantities. The spinning mule, developed by Samuel Crompton in 1779, combined the best features of earlier spinning machines with new innovations. It could produce thread of varying thicknesses, fine enough for delicate muslins or strong enough for industrial uses. The mule was larger, more complex, and was eventually adapted to be powered by water wheels and then steam engines. Before the spinning mule, fine cotton thread had to be imported at great expense. With it, Britain could produce its own high-quality cotton thread, fueling a textile boom that would make cotton cloth affordable for ordinary people for the first time in history. The spinning mule moved textile production from cottages into factories, from individual craftspeople to industrial workers tending machines. It was the embodiment of industrialization. What had been done slowly by hand was now done rapidly by machine, with human workers becoming machine operators rather than craftspeople, a shift that brought both abundance and alienation, wealth and exploitation. But spinning thread was only half of textile production. The other bottleneck was preparing the raw cotton itself. Cotton fibers grow on plants mixed with seeds, and separating the usable fiber from the seeds was extraordinarily tedious work. A worker might labor all day removing seeds from just a few pounds of cotton by hand. This made cotton expensive despite growing abundantly in suitable climates. Cotton had potential to be the most important textile fiber, comfortable, durable, easy to wash, but the labor required to process it limited its use. The cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney in 1793, solved this problem with brutal efficiency. The gin used a rotating cylinder with wire hooks that pulled cotton fibers through a mesh screen too fine for seeds to pass through. Suddenly one worker with a cotton gin could process 50 times as much cotton as they could by hand. Before the cotton gin, cotton was a minor crop, its processing so labor-intensive it could barely compete with wool or linen. With the cotton gin, cotton became king, the most important textile fiber in the world. The American South's economy became built on cotton cultivation. And tragically, the cotton gin's efficiency made cotton farming so profitable that it entrenched slavery, creating a massive demand for labor to plant and harvest cotton that would be quickly processed by gins. The cotton gin is a stark reminder that efficiency and productivity, while seeming neutral, always exist within human systems and can amplify injustice as easily as they create abundance. Technology does not exist apart from the social structures it enters. It reshapes them and is shaped by them in turn. With thread now abundant and cotton processed efficiently, the final stage of textile production was making the thread into clothing. For all of human history, every garment had been sewn by hand, stitch by laborious stitch. A skilled seamstress might take days to make a simple dress, weeks for something elaborate. Clothing was expensive, precious. Most people owned only a few garments, mended and remended until they fell apart. The sewing machine, developed by multiple inventors and perfected by Isaac Singer and others in the mid-19th century, mechanized this final step. A sewing machine used a needle driven by a mechanism that could stitch far faster and more uniformly than any human hand, often 40 or 50 times faster than hand sewing. Before sewing machines, making clothing was one of the most time-consuming household tasks, and ready-made clothing barely existed. With sewing machines, clothing became affordable, varied, fashionable even for working people. Factories could mass-produce garments. Home seamstresses could take in work and earn money. Fashion became democratized. And like other industrial inventions, the sewing machine shifted work from homes to factories, from individual craft to industrial production, changing women's relationship to work and to the economy. The sewing machine stitched together not just fabric, but the modern ready-made clothing industry that we now take entirely for granted. As industrialization accelerated, as machines became more complex and varied, manufacturers encountered problems with materials that existing substances couldn't solve. Natural rubber, harvested from trees, was useful but had severe limitations. It became sticky and soft in heat, brittle and hard in cold. It dissolved in many solvents. It was useful for waterproofing and a few other applications, but its instability limited broader use. Vulcanized rubber, discovered by Charles Goodyear in 1839 after years of experimentation, transformed rubber from a curiosity into an essential industrial material. Goodyear found that heating rubber with sulfur created chemical bonds between rubber molecules, making the material stable across a wide temperature range. Vulcanized rubber was flexible yet durable, waterproof yet not sticky, resilient to wear. Before vulcanization, rubber products deteriorated quickly and were unsuitable for most applications. With it, rubber became indispensable. Hoses, belts, gaskets, seals, insulation for electrical wires, boots, raincoats, and most importantly, tires. Vulcanized rubber would make the bicycle practical and the automobile possible. It sealed machines against leaks, insulated against electricity, cushioned against shocks. Goodyear died poor, his patents contested, but his discovery became one of the fundamental materials of the industrial and eventually automotive age. Sometimes the most transformative inventions are not machines themselves, but the materials that make machines work reliably in the real world. And with new materials available, with manufacturing becoming more efficient, innovators turned their attention to personal transportation. For thousands of years, walking was the only option for those who couldn't afford a horse. Moving under your own power meant the slow pace of footsteps, limited by human endurance to perhaps a few miles per hour. The bicycle, developed gradually through the 19th century and refined into its modern form by the 1880s, gave individuals a vehicle that multiplied their speed and range dramatically. A bicycle uses gears and wheels to translate human pedaling into forward motion far more efficiently than walking. A person on a bicycle can travel 3 or 4 times as fast as walking while using less energy per mile. Before bicycles, cities were constrained by how far people could walk from their homes to work, perhaps a mile or 2. With bicycles, workers could live 5 or 10 miles from their jobs, could travel to different neighborhoods for entertainment, could visit friends and family across town. The bicycle gave ordinary people, including women for whom horseback riding was often considered improper, a freedom of movement they had never possessed. It was also democratic, affordable compared to horses or carriages, simple enough that anyone could learn to ride. The bicycle craze of the late 19th century changed social patterns, influenced fashion as women demanded more practical clothing they could ride in, and even contributed to women's liberation by providing independence and mobility. And practically, the bicycle solved many of the technical challenges that would soon be applied to motorcycles and automobiles. Chains, gears, pneumatic tires, efficient wheels. The bicycle was personal mobility for the masses, a preview of the automotive age, but powered by human muscle amplified by clever engineering. Yet human muscle, even amplified, had limits. What was needed was a compact, powerful engine that didn't require the bulk and weight of a steam engine's boiler and water supply. What was needed was an engine that could be made small enough to fit on a vehicle, efficient enough to carry its own fuel. The internal combustion engine, developed through the late 19th century by inventors including Nikolaus Otto, Rudolf Diesel, and others, was the answer. Unlike steam engines that burned fuel externally to heat water that then powered pistons, internal combustion engines burned fuel directly inside cylinders, using the expanding gases of combustion to drive pistons with far greater efficiency. These engines were compact, powerful for their weight, and could start quickly without waiting for water to boil. Before internal combustion engines, self-powered vehicles were limited to heavy, slow steam vehicles that needed frequent stops for water and fuel. With internal combustion, vehicles could be lighter, faster, more practical. The gasoline engine, and later the diesel engine, would power automobiles, trucks, tractors, aircraft, generators, and countless other machines. The internal combustion engine gave humanity portable power, the ability to carry a tireless mechanical servant wherever it was needed. It made individual transportation practical, not just for the wealthy, but eventually for ordinary people. And like the steam engine before it, it multiplied human capability, freeing people from dependence on muscle power, animal or human. But even with practical automobiles made possible by internal combustion engines, cars remained expensive luxuries, built one at a time by skilled craftsmen. Each vehicle was slightly different, took weeks or months to complete, and cost as much as several years' wages for an average worker. Cars existed, but they were toys for the rich, not practical transportation for the masses. The automobile assembly line, perfected by Henry Ford and implemented at his Highland Park plant in 1913, changed this completely. Ford's insight was to bring the principles of standardization and division of labor to automobile manufacturing. Instead of teams of workers building cars from start to finish, each worker would perform one specific task as vehicles moved past them on a conveyor. Each part was standardized, interchangeable, and the entire process was timed and optimized. Before the assembly line, Ford's workers took 12 hours to build a car. With the assembly line, the time dropped to 90 minutes. Production soared. Costs plummeted. The Model T, which had cost $850 in 1908, cost just $260 by 1924, affordable for middle-class families. Ford famously paid his workers $5 a day, far above prevailing wages, both to reduce turnover, and so his own workers could afford to buy the cars they built. The assembly line made automobiles a mass product, transforming them from luxury to necessity, reshaping cities, enabling suburbs, changing courtship patterns, leisure activities, where people lived and worked. But it also represented the culmination of industrial logic. Maximum efficiency, complete standardization, workers reduced to repetitive motions, human labor synchronized with machine rhythm. The assembly line was productivity perfected and humanity mechanized, abundance achieved through monotony. From steam engines that powered factories to assembly lines that produced cars by the millions, from spinning machines that made cloth abundant to sewing machines that stitched it into clothing, from vulcanized rubber that sealed and cushioned and rolled to bicycles and automobiles that carried people farther and faster than legs alone ever could. The Industrial Revolution was the moment when machines replaced muscle, when human and animal power gave way to mechanical force, when production increased beyond anything possible in pre-industrial economies. It brought unprecedented wealth and devastating exploitation, miraculous abundance and deadening repetition, liberation from back-breaking labor and alienation from meaningful work. It created the modern world with all its complexities, contradictions, and comforts. It was not a simple story of progress, but a transformation that contained both light and shadow, both promise and peril. Rest now, in this moment between eras. The machines are quiet for the night. The assembly lines have stopped. The steam has dissipated. Let the hum of industry fade from your mind like a distant memory, and know that we continue our journey together, that there are gentler inventions ahead, technologies that will connect and illuminate and heal as we move forward through time. The Industrial Revolution had given humanity machines, had multiplied muscle with steam and combustion, had filled factories with the clatter of looms and the pound of hammers. But as the 19th century drew toward its close, another force was emerging, one more mysterious than steam, more versatile than any mechanical engine. This force was invisible, silent, flowing through wires like water through pipes, but moving at nearly the speed of light. It could become light, heat, motion, sound. It could be stored, transmitted across vast distances, transformed from one form to another with extraordinary efficiency. This force was electricity, and it would change human life more completely than perhaps any innovation that had come before. Electricity itself had been observed since ancient times. The Greeks knew that rubbing amber created a strange attractive force. Lightning was obviously electrical, though terrifying and incomprehensible. By the 18th and 19th centuries, scientists like Benjamin Franklin, Alessandro Volta, and Michael Faraday had begun to understand electricity's nature and behavior. They discovered that electricity was the flow of charged particles, that it could be generated by chemical reactions or by moving magnets near coils of wire, that it followed predictable laws. But understanding electricity and harnessing it practically were different challenges. Early electrical experiments were curiosities, demonstrations in laboratories or parlor tricks. What transformed electricity from scientific wonder to world-changing technology was the development of practical generators, systems for transmitting electrical power over distances, and most importantly, useful applications that made electricity valuable to ordinary people. Before practical electricity, homes were lit by candles, oil lamps, or dangerous gas lighting. Communication beyond shouting distance required written messages. Preserving food required ice cut from frozen lakes and stored in insulated ice houses. Entertainment was live, or didn't exist at all. The night was dark, genuinely dark in ways difficult to imagine now, with only flickering flames pushing back the shadows. Electricity changed this darkness forever, but it required specific innovations to become the ubiquitous presence we know today. And perhaps no single application of electricity was more transformative than electric light, but even that required solving a difficult problem, creating a material that could glow brightly when electricity passed through it without immediately burning up or breaking. Carbon filaments were the key to making practical electric light possible. Early attempts at electric lighting used platinum or other materials that either melted too quickly or didn't glow brightly enough. Inventors knew that running electricity through a thin conductor in a vacuum would make it glow as it resisted the current, converting electrical energy to light and heat. But finding the right material was extraordinarily difficult. It needed to withstand high temperatures, needed to glow brightly but not burn away instantly, needed to be manufacturable at reasonable cost. Carbon, in the form of carbonized plant fibers, bamboo, and later specially processed carbon, proved ideal. When heated in the absence of oxygen during manufacture, organic materials transformed into carbon that was strong, resistant to heat, and could glow white-hot when electricity flowed through it in a vacuum. Before carbon filaments, electric lighting was impractical, too expensive, too fragile, too dim. With carbon filaments that could last hundreds of hours before burning out, electric lighting became viable, though still expensive and limited to wealthy homes and public spaces initially. The light bulb, perfected by Thomas Edison and others in the late 1870s, combined the carbon filament with an evacuated glass bulb, an effective seal, and a practical base that could be screwed into a socket. But Edison's genius wasn't just the bulb itself. It was creating an entire system. Generators to produce electricity, wires to transmit it, meters to measure usage, switches, sockets, and standardized voltages. Before the light bulb system, artificial light meant fire in some form, dangerous, dirty, dim, consuming oxygen and producing smoke. With electric lighting, illumination became safe, clean, bright, available at the flip of a switch. The impact was profound and immediate. Factories could operate night shifts safely and productively. Streets could be lit, reducing crime and extending social life into evening hours. Homes became brighter, warmer in feeling if not always in temperature. Reading became easier, eye strain reduced. The electric light didn't just illuminate darkness. It extended the productive day, made night safer and more welcoming, and fundamentally altered human circadian rhythms. For the first time in all of history, humans could choose when to be active independent of the sun's schedule. We became, in a sense, liberated from the tyranny of daylight, though perhaps at the cost of never again experiencing true darkness, true night sky, true silence uninterrupted by the hum of electrical civilization. But electricity needed to be more than just generated and transmitted. Sometimes it needed to be stored, portable, available where wires couldn't reach or when generators weren't running. This required batteries, devices that converted chemical energy into electrical energy and could be carried, installed in vehicles, used to power portable devices. Batteries had existed in primitive forms since Alessandro Volta's pile in 1800. Stacks of metal discs separated by cloth soaked in salt water that produced steady electrical current. But early batteries were weak, short-lived, impractical for most uses. Through the 19th century, batteries improved gradually. Lead-acid batteries, invented by Gaston Planté in 1859, could be recharged and provided substantial power. Later, dry-cell batteries made portable electricity practical for consumers. Before practical batteries, electrical devices needed to be connected to generators or power grids. With batteries, flashlights became possible, allowing people to carry light safely into dark spaces. Telegraph systems could operate in remote locations. Early automobiles could be started with electrical starters powered by batteries, eliminating dangerous hand cranks. As batteries improved through the 20th century, they would power an ever-expanding array of portable devices, from radios to laptops to phones. But even in their earliest forms, batteries represented electricity made portable. Power you could hold in your hand or install where it was needed without wires stretching back to a distant generator. With electricity increasingly available in homes and businesses, inventors could now create machines that would have been impossible before. One of the most transformative was the refrigerator, a device that used electrical power to pump heat from an insulated box, keeping its interior cold continuously and reliably. Before refrigeration, preserving food was one of humanity's most persistent challenges. Food spoiled rapidly, especially in warm weather. Meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried. Vegetables had to be pickled or canned. Fresh food was truly fresh, purchased daily or grown at home, consumed quickly before it rotted. Ice, cut from frozen lakes in winter and stored in insulated ice houses, provided some cooling but required constant replacement, was expensive, and was available only in certain regions. Food waste was enormous. Diets were limited by what could be preserved. Foodborne illness was common. The electric refrigerator, developed in the early 20th century and becoming affordable for households by the 1920s and 30s, changed everything about food. Suddenly food could be kept fresh for days or weeks. Shopping could be done less frequently. Variety increased as foods from distant locations could be transported while refrigerated. Waste decreased dramatically. Food safety improved. The refrigerator was a quiet revolution, humming in the background of daily life, so reliable and ubiquitous that we barely notice it. Yet it fundamentally altered diet, health, domestic labor, and even urban planning, as cities no longer needed daily deliveries of fresh food to every neighborhood. The refrigerator made modern life possible in a way few other inventions can claim, silently preserving, protecting, enabling the abundance we take for granted. But keeping food cold was only part of food safety. Even refrigerated food could harbor dangerous bacteria, and many foods, especially milk, were vehicles for disease. Tuberculosis, typhoid, and other deadly illnesses spread through contaminated dairy products. Milk spoiled rapidly, and even fresh milk often carried pathogens from infected cows or unsanitary handling. Children especially suffered, with infant mortality rates remaining tragically high partly due to contaminated milk. Pasteurization, developed by Louis Pasteur in the 1860s, solved this problem with elegant simplicity. Pasteur discovered that heating liquids to specific temperatures for specific durations killed most harmful bacteria, without significantly affecting taste or nutritional value. For milk, this meant heating to about 160 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 seconds, enough to kill tuberculosis bacteria and other pathogens, but not so much that the milk tasted cooked or lost its properties. Before pasteurization, milk was dangerous, a common source of illness and death. With pasteurization, milk became safe, a nutritious food that children could consume without fear. The process was later applied to other foods, beer, wine, juices, extending shelf life and improving safety across the food system. Pasteurization didn't require expensive equipment or complex technology, just controlled heating, yet it saved millions of lives, particularly children's lives, and made dairy products the wholesome staples we now consider them. It was science applied to public health, invisible when done correctly, but transformative in its impact. As health and safety improved through better food preservation, medicine was also advancing, developing new treatments for pain and illness. For most of history, pain was simply endured. Opium and alcohol could dull it, but these had their own dangers and limitations. Fevers and inflammation, the body's responses to infection and injury, could be deadly, yet doctors had few effective treatments. Aspirin, synthesized in a pure, stable form by Bayer chemist Felix Hoffmann in 1897, gave doctors and patients a safe, effective tool against pain, fever, and inflammation. The compound, acetylsalicylic acid, was based on salicin found in willow bark, used for centuries in folk medicine but inconsistent and often causing stomach upset. Aspirin was standardized, reliable, and could be manufactured consistently. Before aspirin, managing pain and fever was difficult, often involving remedies that were ineffective or dangerous. With aspirin, millions found relief from headaches, arthritis, injuries, fevers. Aspirin didn't cure diseases, but it made illness more bearable, allowed people to function despite minor ailments, and later research would reveal it also reduced heart attack risk, adding another dimension to its value. A simple white tablet, unremarkable in appearance, became one of the most widely used medicines in history, alleviating suffering on a scale difficult to quantify. As medicine advanced, doctors also needed better ways to see inside the human body. For all of history, the interior of a living person was a mystery. Doctors could feel, could listen, could observe symptoms, but what was happening inside could only be guessed. Surgery was done blind, with surgeons relying on anatomical knowledge from dissections, but unable to see exactly what they were cutting until they had already cut. Broken bones could be felt, but their exact position and severity were uncertain. The X-ray, discovered accidentally by Wilhelm Röntgen in 1895, gave doctors vision beyond the skin for the first time. Röntgen was experimenting with cathode rays when he noticed that a fluorescent screen across the room glowed even when his apparatus was covered. He had discovered a new kind of radiation that could pass through soft tissue, but was blocked by dense materials like bone and metal. Within weeks of his discovery, doctors were using X-rays to image broken bones, locate bullets, diagnose conditions that had previously been invisible. Before X-rays, setting a broken bone was partly guesswork. Finding a bullet in a wound was exploratory surgery. Diagnosing tuberculosis required symptoms and autopsy confirmation. With X-rays, the invisible became visible. Doctors could see fractures precisely, could confirm diagnoses, could monitor healing. X-rays revolutionized medicine, making surgery safer and diagnosis more accurate. Later applications would include dental X-rays, mammograms for cancer screening, CT scans combining multiple X-ray images into three-dimensional views. Röntgen refused to patent his discovery, believing it should be freely available for humanity's benefit, and X-rays quickly spread worldwide, saving countless lives and alleviating immeasurable suffering. They were the first medical imaging technology, the beginning of modern diagnostic medicine. And as medicine improved, as people lived longer and healthier lives, attention turned to smaller inconveniences, quality of life improvements that might seem minor but made daily existence more comfortable. One such improvement was vision correction. Eyeglasses had existed for centuries, but they were cumbersome, uncomfortable, limited peripheral vision, fogged in humidity, and were aesthetically unappealing to many. For people with severe vision problems, glasses were essential but often inadequate, and for certain activities, sports, acting, vanity, glasses were problematic. The contact lens, first conceived in the 19th century, but made practical in the early 20th with better materials and manufacturing, offered an alternative. Early contact lenses were large, uncomfortable glass shells that covered much of the eye, wearable only for short periods. But as materials improved, particularly with the development of plastic polymers, contact lenses became smaller, more comfortable, and could be worn for hours or eventually all day. Before practical contact lenses, people with poor vision either wore glasses or struggled without them, limiting their activities and self-image. With contact lenses, vision correction became invisible, freeing people from glasses constraints. Athletes could play without glasses sliding or breaking. Actors could perform without anachronistic eyewear. People felt more confident, more attractive, more capable. Contact lenses were a small innovation in some ways, affecting appearance and convenience rather than survival. But they demonstrate how technology can address not just fundamental needs, but also human desires for dignity, comfort, and self-expression. Not every important invention saves lives. Some simply make life more livable, more pleasant, more fully human. From electricity flowing through wires to light glowing in bulbs, from batteries storing power to refrigerators preserving food, from pasteurization making milk safe to aspirin easing pain, from X-rays revealing hidden injuries to contact lenses correcting vision invisibly, these inventions wove together to create modern life as we know it. They made homes brighter, safer, healthier. They extended life expectancy, reduced suffering, expanded possibilities. They brought comfort, convenience, capability. The world had lit up, both literally with electric light and metaphorically with new understanding, new treatments, new ways of living that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Night was no longer something to fear and endure, but simply another part of the day. Food was abundant and safe. Pain could be managed. The body's interior could be examined. Small imperfections could be corrected. Rest now in this illuminated world. Feel the gentle coolness of refrigerated air, the soft glow of electric light, the comfort of pain's absence, the clarity of corrected vision. Let yourself drift peacefully, knowing that we have reached the threshold of the truly modern world, with still more wonders to discover as our journey continues through time's gentle current toward the present. Humanity had mastered its immediate environment, had built cities and lit them with electricity, had filled homes with machines that eased daily labor. But the world remained vast, separated by distance that constrained travel, trade, and understanding. Oceans took weeks to cross. Continents were months apart. Mountains and deserts isolated populations. A letter sent across the world might arrive after the sender had forgotten writing it, if it arrived at all. Goods produced in one region were unavailable in others. The world was large, disconnected, knowable only in small pieces. What came next was the conquest of distance itself, the development of technologies that would shrink the world, that would make anywhere reachable, that would connect humanity as never before. Distance wouldn't disappear entirely, but it would cease to be the barrier it had always been. The world would become, in a meaningful sense, one place. The dream of flight is ancient, visible in myths of Icarus and Daedalus, in Leonardo da Vinci's sketches of flying machines, in countless imaginations gazing at birds and wondering. For all of human history, people were earthbound, traveling only as far as legs or wheels or ships could carry them, always in contact with ground or water, always constrained by surfaces. The hot air balloon, first successfully flown by the Montgolfier brothers in 1783, gave humans their first real experience of flight. The principle was beautifully simple. Hot air is less dense than cool air, so a large envelope filled with heated air will float upward, lifting a basket beneath it. Before hot air balloons, humans had never risen more than the height they could climb on a ladder or mountain. With balloons, they could ascend thousands of feet, could see the world from perspectives previously reserved for imagination, could drift with the winds across landscapes. Those first flights were extraordinary, terrifying, exhilarating. Passengers reported feeling disconnected from Earth, floating in silence except for the wind, seeing their world from an impossible vantage point. Balloons had limitations, of course. They couldn't be steered except by ascending or descending to catch different wind currents. They were at the mercy of weather. They were impractical for most purposes. But they proved flight was possible, that humans could leave the ground and survive, that the air itself could be a medium of travel. Balloons would find uses in warfare for observation, in science for atmospheric research, in recreation for the sheer joy of flight. And they kept alive the dream that someday, somehow, humans would fly not just as passengers of wind, but as masters of the air. That mastery came in 1903, when Orville and Wilbur Wright achieved the first controlled, powered, heavier-than-air flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The airplane they built combined a lightweight gasoline engine with carefully designed wings that generated lift, with control surfaces that allowed the pilot to steer, climb, and descend. It flew for only 12 seconds on that first flight, covering barely more than 100 feet, less distance than the wingspan of a modern airliner. But it flew, under power and control. Before airplanes, all travel was constrained by terrain. Mountains had to be crossed through passes or tunneled through. Rivers required bridges or ferries. Oceans demanded ships and weeks or months of travel. The airplane simply flew over all obstacles, following straight lines from origin to destination, regardless of what lay between. Early airplanes were fragile, dangerous, capable of carrying only a pilot or 2 passengers. But they improved rapidly. By the end of the First World War, barely 15 years after Kitty Hawk, planes were flying hundreds of miles, carrying bombs and cameras, engaging in aerial combat. By the 1930s, commercial airlines were carrying passengers across continents. By mid-century, transatlantic flight was routine. The airplane made the world accessible in ways unimaginable to previous generations. Journeys that took months by ship took hours by air. Remote locations could be reached directly. Medical emergencies could be evacuated. Fresh foods could be shipped thousands of miles. Business travelers could conduct meetings in distant cities and return home the same day. The airplane didn't eliminate distance, but it reduced its significance enormously. The world became smaller, more connected, more unified. And critically, air travel was democratic. While initially expensive, it became affordable for ordinary people, not just the wealthy. The sky, once the domain of gods and birds and dreams, became humanity's highway. Yet early airplanes had limitations. Propeller engines could only push aircraft so fast before efficiency plummeted. The speed of sound was a barrier, with strange aerodynamic effects making faster flight dangerous or impossible. If aircraft were to become faster, if intercontinental travel was to become truly rapid, a new kind of engine was needed. The jet engine, developed independently by Frank Whittle in Britain and Hans von Ohain in Germany in the late 1930s, revolutionized aviation. Unlike propeller engines that pushed air backward with spinning blades, jet engines worked by compressing air, mixing it with fuel, igniting it, and expelling the hot gases backward at tremendous velocity. The reaction force propelled the aircraft forward. Jet engines were simpler than piston engines in some ways, with fewer moving parts, and they were far more powerful at high speeds and altitudes where thin air rendered propellers ineffective. Before jet engines, the fastest aircraft traveled perhaps 400 miles per hour. With jets, speeds doubled, then tripled. Jets could fly higher, above much of the weather that troubled propeller aircraft. They could carry more passengers and cargo. Most importantly, they made long-distance flight practical and economical. A propeller airliner might take 20 hours to cross the Atlantic with multiple refueling stops. A jet could do it in 7 hours non-stop. Before jets, international travel was an expedition. With jets, it became routine. Business could truly become global. Cultures could interact more directly. The jet engine didn't just make planes faster. It made the entire world accessible to anyone who could afford a ticket, shrinking psychological distance as much as physical distance. But fast travel for people was only part of global connection. Goods needed to move too, raw materials and finished products, the physical stuff of commerce and trade. For centuries, cargo shipping was labor-intensive and inefficient. Goods were loaded onto ships piece by piece, crate by crate, barrel by barrel. At the destination, everything had to be unloaded the same way, then reloaded onto trucks or trains. This took days or weeks. It was expensive. It was prone to theft and damage. It limited how much trade could occur because moving goods was so costly and time-consuming. Container shipping, standardized by Malcolm McLean in the 1950s, transformed global trade with elegant simplicity. McLean's insight was that the cargo container itself, a standardized metal box, should be the unit of shipping. Instead of loading and unloading thousands of individual items, cranes would move whole containers from ships to trucks to trains and back. A container packed at a factory could travel across oceans and continents without being opened until it reached its final destination. Before container shipping, cargo ships might spend more time in port being loaded and unloaded than at sea. With containers, a ship could be unloaded and reloaded in hours. Costs plummeted. Speed increased dramatically. Theft decreased since sealed containers weren't opened in transit. And because containers were standardized, ships, cranes, trucks, and trains could all be designed to handle them efficiently. Container shipping made global supply chains possible. Goods manufactured in Asia could be sold in Europe or America at prices that included shipping costs of mere pennies per item. Manufacturing could be located wherever it was most efficient, with products shipped worldwide. The globalized economy we know today, with its complex international supply chains, with products assembled from components made in a dozen countries, only became possible because of container shipping's efficiency. The container, a simple metal box, became the packaging that wrapped the entire world's economy. Yet as travel became faster and global trade more complex, a new problem emerged: knowing exactly where you were. On land, roads and landmarks provided guidance, but aircraft flying over oceans, ships crossing featureless seas, hikers in wilderness, even drivers in unfamiliar cities, all faced navigation challenges. Maps helped but required skill to use and didn't show your current position, only your approximate location if you could figure out where you were. GPS, the global positioning system, solved this problem with a technology that seems almost like magic. Developed by the US military and made available for civilian use in the 1980s and 90s, GPS uses a constellation of satellites orbiting Earth, each broadcasting precise time signals. A GPS receiver on the ground or in a vehicle listens to signals from multiple satellites, calculates how long each signal took to arrive based on tiny time differences, and uses that information to determine its exact position, usually within a few meters. Before GPS, navigation required skill, experience, and constant attention. Pilots used radio beacons and dead reckoning. Ships used sextants and star positions. Drivers used paper maps and asked for directions. Getting lost was common. With GPS, navigation became trivial. A device no larger than a phone could tell you exactly where you were, could show you the route to any destination, could update in real time as you moved. GPS made getting lost nearly impossible. It enabled precision farming, where tractors plant seeds in exact patterns. It enabled emergency services to locate callers in distress. It enabled ride-sharing services that depend on knowing exactly where drivers and passengers are. GPS made location into data, turned the entire Earth into a coordinate system where every point could be identified precisely. And like so many transformative technologies, it became so reliable and ubiquitous that we stopped noticing it was remarkable, simply expecting our devices to always know where we are and how to get where we're going. From balloons drifting on winds to jets crossing oceans in hours, from container ships carrying the world's commerce to GPS satellites making location always knowable, these inventions conquered distance, the ancient barrier that had separated humans, isolated cultures, limited understanding. The world didn't literally shrink, but experientially it did. Distance ceased to be destiny. Location ceased to be isolation. And humanity became, for the first time in its long history, truly connected, able to move people, goods, and information anywhere, anytime, almost effortlessly. Rest now in this connected world. Feel the gentle motion of travel, the certainty of knowing where you are, the ease of reaching anywhere. Let distance dissolve into insignificance, and drift peacefully knowing our journey continues, knowing there are still more transformations to explore. The world was now connected physically, shrunk by jets and containers and satellites. But physical connection was only the beginning. Something more profound was emerging, a transformation that would touch every aspect of human life more intimately than steam engines or electric lights ever had. This was the digital revolution, the moment when information itself became the most valuable commodity, when computation and communication merged, when the tools of thought became as important as the tools of physical labor had been to the Industrial Revolution. At the heart of this revolution was a device so small, so seemingly insignificant, that it's difficult to believe how much depended on it. For decades, electronic devices had used vacuum tubes, glass bulbs containing heated filaments and metal plates that could amplify electrical signals or act as switches. But vacuum tubes were large, hot, fragile, and consumed enormous amounts of power. A computer built with vacuum tubes might fill an entire room, require constant maintenance, and break down frequently as tubes burned out. The transistor, invented at Bell Labs in 1947 by John Bardeen, Walter Brattain, and William Shockley, changed everything about electronics. A transistor is a solid-state device made from semiconductor materials, usually silicon, that can amplify signals or act as an electronic switch, just like a vacuum tube. But it's tiny, durable, uses minimal power, and generates little heat. A single transistor can fit on a surface smaller than a pinhead. Before transistors, electronics were limited by the size, power consumption, and unreliability of vacuum tubes. With transistors, electronics became small, efficient, and reliable. The immediate impact was portable radios, hearing aids, and other consumer devices that suddenly became pocket-sized. But the deeper impact was on computing. Computers built with transistors instead of tubes were faster, more reliable, and dramatically smaller. And crucially, transistors could be manufactured in ever-increasing numbers on single chips of silicon. From thousands to millions to billions of transistors on a chip, each one switching on and off millions of times per second, performing calculations, storing data, enabling the digital world. The transistor was the foundation of everything digital that followed, the invisible switch that made information processing possible at scales unimaginable with earlier technology. But transistors alone weren't enough. Through the 1950s and 60s, computers existed mainly in government labs, universities, and large corporations. They were expensive, required specialized knowledge to operate, and were used mainly for scientific calculations, business data processing, and military applications. Computers were tools for institutions, not individuals. The personal computer, emerging in the 1970s and becoming practical and affordable in the 80s with machines like the Apple II, the IBM PC, and later the Macintosh, democratized computing. These were computers small enough to fit on a desk, affordable enough for middle-class families, and crucially, useful enough to justify the expense. Early personal computers were used for word processing, spreadsheets, games, education, and gradually for more sophisticated tasks as software developed. Before personal computers, computing power was centralized, controlled by institutions, accessible only to specialists. With personal computers, individuals could process information, could create and manipulate documents, could program, could play, could explore. Knowledge work became possible at home. Small businesses could manage inventory and accounting without expensive mainframes. Students could write and revise papers without typewriters. The personal computer was the beginning of the information age at the individual level, the moment when ordinary people gained access to computational power that had previously required institutional resources. And critically, personal computers were general-purpose machines, programmable, adaptable, able to do whatever software instructed them to do. They were tools for thought, amplifiers of human intellect, as transformative for mental work as steam engines had been for physical labor. Yet personal computers, initially, were isolated. Each machine was its own island of computation and information. If you wanted to share files, you used floppy disks, physically carrying data from one machine to another. Communication between computers was possible but complicated, requiring modems and phone lines and technical knowledge. Computers were powerful but disconnected. The Internet, developed gradually from the 1960s through the 80s, connected computers into a global network. The Internet grew from military and academic networks designed to be resilient, with data traveling in packets that could take different routes to reach their destination, reconstructing at the receiving end. This design meant no single point of failure could bring down the network. As more institutions connected, as standards were developed and refined, the Internet became a backbone for digital communication. Before the Internet, computer networks were local or proprietary, limited to organizations, or requiring expensive dedicated connections. With the Internet, any computer could potentially communicate with any other computer anywhere in the world. Email became possible, nearly instantaneous communication that was cheaper than phone calls and more convenient than postal mail. File transfers allowed researchers to share data. Remote login let scientists access distant supercomputers. The Internet was infrastructure, not something most users interacted with directly, but it was the foundation that made the next revolution possible. That revolution came in 1991 when Tim Berners-Lee, working at CERN, introduced the World Wide Web. The web wasn't the Internet itself, but a system that ran on top of it, using hypertext to link documents together, creating a web of interconnected information. The web used three key innovations: HTML to format documents, HTTP to transfer them, and URLs to address them uniquely. But the real innovation was conceptual. The idea that information could be linked, that you could click on text and instantly jump to related information anywhere in the world. Before the World Wide Web, finding information online required knowing where it was, required technical knowledge of systems and commands. The web made information accessible to anyone with a browser. Click a link, see a page. Click another link, see another page. Simple, intuitive, revolutionary. The web made the Internet usable for ordinary people. And as millions of people began creating web pages, the amount of available information exploded. Libraries' worth of knowledge became accessible from any connected computer. Businesses established web presences. News became instant. Communication became global and open. The web didn't just organize information. It created a new kind of public space, digital and boundless, where anyone could publish, anyone could find, anyone could connect. But the web, and the Internet beneath it, depended on physical infrastructure. Cables connecting computers, carrying data at speeds limited by the cable's capacity. For decades, data traveled mainly through copper wires or older fiber optic systems that were expensive and limited. As more people connected, as web pages grew richer with images and eventually video, bandwidth, the capacity to transmit data, became the bottleneck. Optical fiber, refined and made practical through the 1970s and 80s, solved this bottleneck. Optical fibers are strands of ultra-pure glass, thinner than human hair, that carry data as pulses of light rather than electrical signals. Light travels through these fibers with minimal loss, can carry far more data than electrical signals through copper, and is immune to electrical interference. A single optical fiber can carry terabits of data per second, millions of times more than old copper phone lines. Before modern optical fiber, long-distance data transmission was slow and expensive. With optical fiber forming the backbone of the internet, data could flow freely at speeds that made video streaming, video calls, large file transfers, and cloud computing practical. Optical fiber is invisible to users, buried underground or laid across ocean floors, but it's the physical medium carrying the digital world. Every video you stream, every video call you make, every cloud document you access, travels as light pulses through glass fibers spanning continents and oceans. Optical fiber gave the digital revolution the bandwidth it needed to flourish, made distance irrelevant for data transmission, made the internet fast enough to become central to modern life. And many of the technologies enabling optical fiber and countless other digital applications depended on another invention that seems almost like science fiction: the laser. Lasers produce coherent light. Light waves all the same frequency and in phase, focused into tight beams that can travel long distances without spreading, can carry information, can cut steel, can perform surgery, can read barcodes and CDs and DVDs. The laser, first demonstrated in 1960 by Theodore Maiman, operates on quantum mechanical principles that aren't intuitive, but produce remarkably useful results. Before lasers, light was chaotic, spreading in all directions, multiple frequencies mixed together. Lasers tamed light, organized it, made it into a tool. Lasers read data from optical discs. They transmit data through optical fibers. They perform precise surgeries, cutting tissue or reshaping corneas without the imprecision of blades. They measure distances with extraordinary accuracy for construction and manufacturing. They scan barcodes at checkout counters. They create spectacular light shows. The laser was pure science, quantum physics made practical, and it became essential to countless applications, most invisible to users but critical to modern technology. As the digital world grew, as commerce moved online, a practical problem emerged: how to pay for things without cash. Carrying cash was inconvenient and risky. Checks required banks to clear them, a slow process. What was needed was a way to make payment instant, secure, and widely accepted. The credit card, in its modern form with magnetic stripes and widespread acceptance, developed through the mid-20th century, provided this solution. Credit cards aren't just pieces of plastic. They're access points to electronic payment networks that can verify your identity, check your credit limit, and transfer funds between accounts instantly. Before credit cards, commerce at distance required cash on delivery or cumbersome payment arrangements. With credit cards, you could purchase anywhere that accepted them, with payment handled invisibly through electronic networks. Credit cards enabled online commerce, made travel easier without carrying large amounts of cash, provided security against theft, and created detailed records of transactions. They turned money into information, into numbers in databases, rather than physical objects to be carried and guarded. And while they brought their own problems, debt and fraud among them, they were essential infrastructure for the modern economy, making commerce as fast and frictionless as digital networks could support. Yet amid all these sophisticated technologies, one of the most beloved inventions of the late 20th century was remarkably simple. A small piece of paper with weak adhesive on one edge, allowing it to stick temporarily to surfaces and be removed and restuck without damage. The Post-it note, invented accidentally by Spencer Silver at 3 meter in 1968 and turned into a product by Art Fry in 1974, seems almost trivial compared to transistors and the internet. Silver was trying to create a super strong adhesive, but instead made one that was weak and reusable. For years it seemed useless. Then Fry, frustrated with bookmarks falling out of his hymnal, realized weak adhesive was perfect for temporary notes. Before Post-it notes, Marking pages or leaving notes required tape that damaged paper, paper clips that fell off, or separate notes that got lost. Post-it notes solved these problems elegantly, sticking reliably but removably, visible but not permanent. They became ubiquitous in offices, homes, schools, everywhere people needed to mark, note, or temporarily attach information. The post-it note demonstrates that innovation isn't always about complexity or high technology. Sometimes it's about solving small, everyday problems with simple, clever solutions that improve life in ways we quickly take for granted. From transistors that fit billions on a chip to personal computers that brought computing to individuals, from the internet connecting machines worldwide to the World Wide Web making information accessible to everyone, from optical fiber carrying light-speed data to lasers reading and writing and measuring, from credit cards digitizing money to post-it notes solving everyday problems. The digital revolution transformed information itself into the raw material of progress and commerce and daily life. Information became valuable in ways it never had been before. Not just what you knew, but how quickly you could access and process knowledge. Computation became as important as manufacturing. Digital became as real as physical. And the world shifted from an industrial economy built on making things to an information economy built on knowing things, connecting things, processing things. Rest now in this digital world. Feel the information flowing invisibly around you, the connections linking every computer, every phone, every device. Let the complexity fade into simplicity, the technology becoming invisible, and drift peacefully knowing we approach the end of our journey, knowing there are just a few more wonders to discover before morning comes. As the world became connected and digital, as grand technologies transformed commerce and communication, something else was happening quietly in the background. Inventors were solving small problems, everyday inconveniences that people had simply accepted for generations. These weren't inventions that changed the course of history in obvious ways, weren't dramatic breakthroughs that made headlines. They were humble innovations that made daily life just a little easier, a little more convenient, a little less frustrating. Yet cumulatively, these small inventions may have improved quality of life as much as any grand technology, touching millions of moments in millions of lives. So common we forget they were ever invented at all. Consider something as simple as closing your jacket. For most of human history, clothing was fastened with buttons, hooks, laces, or ties. These worked after a fashion, but they were slow, fiddly, difficult for children or people with limited dexterity. Buttons could fall off. Laces came untied. And for certain applications, boots, luggage, tents, existing fasteners were inadequate, either too weak or too cumbersome. The zipper, perfected gradually through the late 19th and early 20th centuries with key improvements by Whitcomb Judson, and especially Gideon Sundback, provided an elegant alternative. The zipper uses two strips of interlocking metal or plastic teeth that mesh together when a slider is pulled upward and separate when pulled downward. Before practical zippers, getting dressed took time, fastening the many buttons on typical clothing. Bags and luggage were secured with straps and buckles. With zippers, fastening became instantaneous. One smooth motion, and your jacket was closed, your bag sealed, your boots secured. The impact seems small until you consider how many times each day we use zippers without thought, how much time they save cumulatively, how much easier they make dressing for children and the elderly, how they enable certain clothing designs that wouldn't be practical with buttons. Zippers are on pants and jackets, on sleeping bags and tents, on luggage and backpacks, on cushion covers and countless other items. The zipper is nearly invisible in its ubiquity, a perfect example of an invention that solved a minor problem so completely that we can barely imagine life without it. It's the small convenience that makes modern life feel modern, the tiny improvement that compounds across millions of uses into genuine progress. Similarly, cooking had always involved a problem: food sticking to pans. For thousands of years, cooks dealt with this by using plenty of oil or fat, by constant stirring, by scrubbing burnt remnants from cookware after every meal. Certain delicate foods were nearly impossible to cook without them sticking and tearing. Eggs were notorious for adhering stubbornly to pan surfaces, and cleaning stuck on food was one of the most tedious kitchen tasks. Teflon, discovered accidentally by Roy Plunkett at DuPont in 1938, solved this problem in a way that still seems almost magical. Teflon is polytetrafluoroethylene, a synthetic polymer with an extraordinarily slippery surface. Almost nothing sticks to Teflon. When applied as a coating to cookware, it creates a non-stick surface that allows cooking with minimal oil, prevents food from adhering, and makes cleanup trivially easy. Before Teflon, cooking certain foods required skill and patience and generous amounts of fat. With Teflon-coated pans, anyone could cook eggs or fish or delicate sauces without sticking, without burning, without frustration. Cleanup became a quick rinse rather than vigorous scrubbing. Healthier cooking became possible with less oil. Teflon didn't just make cooking easier, it made it more accessible, more pleasant, less of a chore. And beyond cookware, Teflon found applications in countless industrial and consumer products. Clothing treatment for water resistance, wire insulation, machinery that needed low-friction surfaces. Teflon was a material that seemed to defy common sense. Nothing stuck to it, and that impossible property made it invaluable in ways both mundane and sophisticated. As materials science advanced, so did food preparation. Cooking had always been time-consuming, requiring careful attention to prevent burning or uneven heating. Conventional ovens heated food slowly, from the outside in, requiring precise timing and temperature control. For people with busy lives, preparing hot meals took time many didn't have. The microwave oven, invented accidentally by Percy Spencer at Raytheon in 1945, when he noticed a chocolate bar in his pocket, had melted while he worked with radar equipment, revolutionized cooking through an entirely different principle. Microwaves are electromagnetic radiation that causes water molecules in food to vibrate rapidly, generating heat from within the food itself. This allows food to be heated quickly and efficiently, in minutes or even seconds rather than the half-hour or more conventional ovens required. Before microwave ovens, reheating food meant using a stovetop or oven, waiting for it to heat, often drying out or unevenly heating the food. With microwaves, leftovers could be hot and ready to eat in 2 minutes. Frozen meals could be prepared without thawing. Tea water could boil in a minute. Cooking became faster, more convenient, more flexible. The microwave oven changed eating patterns, made busy schedules more manageable, enabled frozen and prepared foods that could be ready almost instantly. It wasn't always the best way to cook. Microwaves don't brown or crisp food well, but for speed and convenience, nothing else compared. The microwave made hot food available anytime with minimal effort, fitting perfectly into the accelerating pace of modern life. And microwaves were particularly transformative when combined with another innovation: frozen food. Food preservation had always been crucial, but traditional methods, salting, smoking, drying, canning, often changed food's taste and texture significantly. Fresh food was fresh, preserved food was something else, usually inferior. Frozen food, pioneered commercially by Clarence Birdseye in the 1920s, preserved food's quality far better than previous methods. Birdseye's key insight was that rapid freezing, using very cold temperatures to freeze food quickly, prevented large ice crystals from forming and damaging food's cellular structure. Food frozen rapidly and stored at low temperatures retained much of its original texture and nutritional value. Before practical frozen food, diets were limited by season and locality. Vegetables and fruits were available only when harvested. Fish and meat had to be consumed quickly or preserved by methods that altered them substantially. With frozen food, seasonal became year-round. Summer berries could be enjoyed in winter. Fish caught in Alaska could be eaten fresh-tasting in Kansas months later. Meals could be prepared ahead, frozen, and reheated when convenient. Grocery shopping could be done weekly rather than daily, because frozen food lasted months. Frozen food, combined with refrigerators and freezers and microwave ovens, created a new relationship with meals and groceries, making variety and convenience both possible in ways that would have astounded earlier generations. It was preservation that didn't feel like preservation, food that tasted fresh despite being months old. While inventors were solving cooking and food problems, others tackled the challenge of fastening things together temporarily. Buttons and zippers were permanent fasteners, sewn or attached to items. But sometimes you needed to attach things temporarily, to adjust or remove them easily. Laces worked but were slow. Buckles and snaps required precise alignment. What was needed was a fastener that was quick, adjustable, and reusable. Velcro, invented by George de Mestral in 1941 after observing burrs sticking to his dog's fur, provided exactly this. De Mestral examined the burrs under a microscope and saw tiny hooks that caught in loops of fur and fabric. He created a synthetic version, one strip covered with tiny hooks, another with small loops. Press them together and they grip firmly. Pull them apart and they separate with a distinctive ripping sound, ready to be reattached. Before Velcro, temporary fastening was awkward and limited. With Velcro, shoes could be fastened without tying laces, particularly helpful for children and people with arthritis or limited mobility. Straps could be adjusted instantly. Medical devices could be secured comfortably. Space suits used Velcro extensively since buttons and zippers were difficult to operate with gloved hands in zero gravity. Velcro was simple, obvious in retrospect like many great inventions, yet it opened possibilities that hadn't existed before. It made fastening accessible to everyone regardless of dexterity, made adjustment instantaneous, made temporary attachment reliable. The sound of Velcro separating became one of the small, distinctive sounds of modern life, instantly recognizable, somehow satisfying. And finally, consider the problem of quick repairs, temporary fixes, holding things together when proper repair wasn't immediately possible. Traditional tapes, masking tape, cellophane tape, had limited strength and didn't stick well to all surfaces. Glues were permanent and required time to set. What was needed was something strong, versatile, that would stick to almost anything and hold temporarily, or even semi-permanently. Duct tape, developed during World War II for military use and later adapted for consumer applications, became the ultimate quick-fix material. Duct tape consists of fabric mesh coated with aggressive adhesive, creating a tape that's strong, tears cleanly by hand, conforms to irregular surfaces, and sticks to almost everything. Before duct tape, temporary repairs required tools, skill, and appropriate materials for each situation. With duct tape, almost anything could be temporarily fixed. Torn fabric, leaking hoses, broken handles, loose parts. Duct tape became legendary for its versatility and reliability. It held spacecraft together, literally, during the Apollo 13 mission when astronauts used it to adapt air filtration systems. It patched tents, secured cables, temporarily mended broken items of every description. Duct tape represents human ingenuity in its most practical form. A simple material that solves countless problems adequately if not perfectly, that's affordable and accessible, that requires no special skill to use. It's the embodiment of good enough, of making do, of creative problem solving with available materials. And like the post-it note, it shows that sometimes the most beloved inventions aren't the most sophisticated, just the ones that solve everyday problems in ways that feel almost magical in their simplicity. From zippers that close instantly to Teflon that nothing sticks to, from microwave ovens that heat food in seconds to frozen food that preserves summer's harvest for winter, from Velcro that fastens without tying to duct tape that fixes nearly anything, these inventions don't change the world dramatically. They change it incrementally, moment by moment, making daily life smoother, easier, less frustrating. They're the small comforts that accumulate into genuine quality of life, the tiny conveniences we notice only in their absence. Rest now in this comfortable world. Feel the zipper's smooth closure, the non-stick pan's easy cleaning, the microwave's quick heating, the Velcro's satisfying grip, the duct tape holding things together. Let these small comforts surround you, and drift peacefully, knowing we approach the end of our long journey through innovation. Throughout our journey, we've seen how humans reshaped their world, built cities and machines, connected continents, and created digital realms. But underlying all of this, enabling it all, was something more fundamental. Life itself, human life, fragile and precious and far too short. For most of human history, life expectancy was brutally low. A child born had perhaps a 50-50 chance of reaching adulthood. Disease swept through populations, killing indiscriminately. Infections from minor wounds could be fatal. Childbirth was dangerous for both mother and infant. Plagues could devastate entire regions. Humanity built wonders, but watched helplessly as loved ones died from causes we couldn't understand or prevent. What changed this, what allowed populations to grow and lifespans to extend and infant mortality to plummet, was medicine, but not the medicine of bleeding and humors and superstition that had existed for centuries. It was scientific medicine, based on understanding diseases' actual causes, on interventions that worked for reasons we could explain and reproduce. The inventions that extended human life and reduced suffering may be the most important of all. For what good is a world of marvels if we don't live long enough to enjoy it? The deadliest scourge throughout human history was infectious disease. Smallpox, measles, polio, tuberculosis, influenza, plague, these killed billions across the centuries. Until the late 18th century, there was no effective way to prevent disease, only to treat symptoms and hope for recovery. Diseases ran their course. You either survived or you didn't, and no one knew why some lived while others died from the same illness. Vaccines changed this equation more completely than perhaps any other medical advance. The principle of vaccination was discovered by Edward Jenner in 1796, when he observed that milkmaids who contracted cowpox, a mild disease, seemed immune to smallpox, a devastating one. Jenner deliberately infected a boy with cowpox and later exposed him to smallpox. The boy didn't get sick. What Jenner had discovered, though he couldn't explain it, was that exposure to one disease could provide immunity to a related one, that the body could learn to recognize and fight specific pathogens. Before vaccines, smallpox alone killed hundreds of millions of people. Children died by the thousands in epidemic waves that swept through communities unpredictably. Survivors were often left scarred or blinded. The disease was feared above almost all others, and there was nothing anyone could do except quarantine the sick and hope the epidemic would pass. With vaccination, smallpox became preventable. Over the following 2 centuries, vaccines were developed for disease after disease. Polio, measles, mumps, rubella, diphtheria, tetanus, and many more. Diseases that had been death sentences became rare or extinct. Smallpox, which had killed so many for so long, was completely eradicated by 1980, eliminated from Earth through a global vaccination campaign. Children who once had perhaps a 1 in 5 chance of dying before age 5 now had survival rates exceeding 99% in developed countries. Vaccines didn't cure disease. They prevented it, which was even better. They trained the immune system to recognize threats before encountering them, turning the body's own defenses into protection. Vaccines extended lifespans by decades, allowed populations to grow, enabled the modern world by ensuring children survived to become adults who could learn, work, create, and contribute. Few inventions have saved more lives or prevented more suffering than vaccines. Yet they work silently, invisibly, preventing diseases most people in developed countries never see and can barely imagine. Yet vaccines prevented diseases caused by viruses, and even with vaccines, bacterial infections remained dangerous throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. A scratch could become infected and kill. Surgery was incredibly risky because post-operative infections were common and usually fatal. Pneumonia, strep throat, tuberculosis, these bacterial diseases killed millions. Doctors could diagnose them but couldn't cure them, could only provide comfort and hope the patient's own immune system would prevail. Penicillin, discovered accidentally by Alexander Fleming in 1928, when he noticed that mold growing in a bacterial culture had killed the surrounding bacteria, inaugurated the age of antibiotics. Fleming identified that the mold, a penicillium species, produced a substance that killed bacteria without harming human cells. But it took years before penicillin could be mass-produced, a breakthrough achieved in the early 1940s, just in time to save countless soldiers in World War II from infected wounds that would have been fatal in earlier conflicts. Before penicillin and other antibiotics, bacterial infections were often death sentences. Simple strep throat could lead to heart damage or death. Pneumonia killed even young, healthy people. Childbirth fever, caused by bacterial infection, killed women by the thousands. Tuberculosis was a slow death sentence, consuming its victims over months or years. With antibiotics, these infections became curable, often within days. A course of penicillin could turn a life-threatening illness into a minor inconvenience. Surgery became far safer because infections could be prevented or treated. Life expectancy increased by years, even decades, as infections that would have killed were instead cured with simple injections or pills. Penicillin was the first antibiotic, but it opened the door to discovering many others, each effective against different bacteria. Antibiotics transformed medicine, made it possible to treat rather than just diagnose, gave doctors tools that actually worked. The discovery of antibiotics may be second only to vaccines in lives saved and suffering prevented. Together, these two innovations, preventing and curing infectious disease, did more to extend human life than all other medical advances combined. Yet some diseases couldn't be prevented by vaccines or didn't respond to antibiotics. Malaria, caused by parasites rather than bacteria or viruses, had killed humans for millennia, particularly in tropical regions where the mosquitoes that carry malaria thrive. Malaria caused recurring fevers, weakness, organ damage, death. It shaped where humans could live, making some regions nearly uninhabitable. It killed explorers, colonists, soldiers, and local populations by the millions. Quinine, extracted from the bark of South American cinchona trees and isolated in pure form in the early 19th century, provided the first effective treatment for malaria. Indigenous peoples had used cinchona bark for centuries, but European medicine initially dismissed it as superstition. Eventually, its effectiveness became undeniable. Quinine could treat malaria's symptoms, suppressing the parasites though not completely eliminating them from the body. Before quinine, malaria was a deadly threat with no treatment except rest and hope. With quinine, malaria became survivable, manageable. European colonial expansion into Africa and Asia was enabled partly by quinine, which allowed colonizers to survive in malarial regions. This had complex and often tragic consequences, but quinine's medical importance is undeniable. It saved countless lives, allowed development of regions that had been too dangerous for sustained habitation, and demonstrated that even ancient folk remedies could have genuine medical value. Later synthetic anti-malarial drugs would build on quinine's foundation, but quinine itself remained crucial for treating drug-resistant malaria strains. A compound from tree bark, known to indigenous peoples, but ignored by European science for centuries, turned out to be life-saving medicine, a reminder that knowledge can come from unexpected sources, and that dismissing traditional practices is often foolish. As medicine advanced, as doctors learned to prevent and treat disease, a deeper question emerged. What exactly was happening inside living cells, inside the molecules of life itself? How did traits pass from parents to children? What caused cells to grow normally or become cancerous? Why did diseases affect some people, but not others? These questions couldn't be answered without understanding life at its most fundamental level, at the level of DNA, the molecule that carries genetic information. DNA sequencing, the ability to read the order of chemical bases that make up DNA molecules, developed gradually from the 1970s onward with key breakthroughs by Frederick Sanger and others, revolutionized biology and medicine. For the first time, scientists could read the genetic code, could understand exactly what genes did, could identify mutations that caused disease, could compare genomes between individuals and species. Before DNA sequencing, genetics was indirect, inferring gene function from breeding patterns and observable traits. With sequencing, genes became readable text, information that could be analyzed, compared, understood. The Human Genome Project, completed in 2003, sequenced all 3 billion base pairs of human DNA, creating a reference map of human genetics. This opened extraordinary possibilities. Identifying disease genes, understanding cancer's genetic basis, developing targeted therapies, predicting disease risk, even editing genes to correct defects. DNA sequencing transformed medicine from treating symptoms to understanding root causes at the molecular level. Cancer treatments could be tailored to specific tumor genetics. Rare genetic diseases could be diagnosed definitively. Prenatal screening could identify conditions before birth. Ancestry and evolutionary relationships could be traced with precision. And the cost of sequencing plummeted from billions of dollars for the first human genome to hundreds of dollars today, making personalized genetic medicine increasingly practical. DNA sequencing represents humanity reading its own instruction manual, understanding life's code, gaining the knowledge to potentially rewrite it. The implications are still unfolding, raising profound ethical questions about genetic modification, designer babies, privacy, and the very definition of human nature. But medically, DNA sequencing is opening possibilities for treating and preventing disease that would have seemed like fantasy just decades ago. We are learning to understand life at its deepest level, and that understanding is translating into longer, healthier lives. From vaccines that teach our bodies to fight disease before it strikes, to penicillin that cures infections that once killed, from quinine that tames malaria to DNA sequencing that reveals life's deepest secrets. These medical innovations have done what seemed impossible for most of human history. They've pushed back death, extended life, reduced suffering on a scale unprecedented in all the millions of years of human existence. Life expectancy in the year 1800 was perhaps 30 years. Today in developed countries it exceeds 80 years, and it continues rising. Infant mortality has plummeted. Diseases that terrified our ancestors barely exist. We live longer, healthier lives than any humans before us, and medicine continues advancing, promising even longer, healthier futures. These inventions didn't conquer death entirely. That remains beyond our grasp, at least for now. But they've given us time, precious years and decades that previous generations never had. Time to learn and love and create and experience, and simply be alive in this remarkable world we've built together over centuries of innovation. Rest now, peacefully, in this extended life. Feel your breath, steady and easy, your heart beating strong, your body healthy in ways that would have been impossible without these medical marvels working invisibly to protect and sustain you. Let yourself drift into sleep, grateful for the gift of time, for the years these innovations have given us, and know that our long journey through invention is nearly complete. We have traveled together through thousands of years of human innovation, from fire's first spark to DNA's decoded sequences, from wheels turning on ancient carts to data flowing through optical fibers at light speed. But as the 20th century progressed and the 21st began, humanity's ambitions turned upward and forward, beyond our planet, beyond our current limitations. We began to ask not just how to improve life on Earth, but how to extend life beyond it, how to power our civilization sustainably, how to reach for the stars that had gazed down on us since our ancestors first looked up in wonder. Energy has always been the foundation of progress, from fire and muscle to steam and electricity. But the fossil fuels that powered the Industrial Revolution and the modern world, coal, oil, natural gas, had problems that became increasingly obvious. They were finite, running out slowly but inevitably. They polluted air and water, and burning them released carbon dioxide that changed Earth's climate. The 20th century ran on fossil fuels, but it became clear that the 21st would need something different, something cleaner, something sustainable. The fuel cell, first demonstrated by William Grove in 1839, but made practical only in the 20th century, offered one vision of clean energy. A fuel cell generates electricity through a chemical reaction between hydrogen and oxygen, producing only water as a byproduct. Unlike combustion engines that burn fuel inefficiently, creating waste heat and pollution, fuel cells convert chemical energy directly to electrical energy with high efficiency and zero emissions at the point of use. Before practical fuel cells, portable power meant batteries that eventually died and needed replacement, or combustion engines that required fuel and produced pollution. Fuel cells promised portable, clean power that could run as long as hydrogen was supplied. They were used in spacecraft, where their only byproduct, water, could be consumed by astronauts. They powered experimental vehicles. They provided backup power for critical facilities. The challenge with fuel cells has always been producing and storing hydrogen efficiently and safely. Hydrogen is abundant in water, but requires energy to extract. Still, fuel cells represent a possible future. Vehicles and devices powered by hydrogen, emitting only water vapor, refueling as quickly as gasoline cars, but without pollution. The fuel cell hasn't yet transformed our world the way some predicted, but it remains a technology of enormous potential. A clean energy solution, waiting for the infrastructure and technology to make it practical at scale. Another clean energy source, one more abundant and accessible, shines down on Earth constantly, has done so for billions of years, will continue for billions more. The sun pours energy onto Earth's surface continuously, far more energy than humanity could ever use. For most of history, we captured solar energy only indirectly, through plants that grew in sunlight, through warmth on our skin. What was needed was a way to convert sunlight directly into electricity, to capture that abundant, clean, free energy and make it useful. The solar cell, or photovoltaic cell, developed in the 1950s and refined over subsequent decades, does exactly this. Solar cells are made from semiconductor materials, usually silicon, that generate electrical current when struck by sunlight. The photovoltaic effect, discovered in the 19th century, remained a laboratory curiosity until transistor research made practical semiconductor devices possible. Before solar cells, electricity required generators powered by falling water, steam from burning fuel, or chemical reactions in batteries. All required infrastructure, fuel sources, moving parts that wore out. Solar cells had none of these limitations. They sat silently, no moving parts, converting sunlight directly to electricity for decades with minimal maintenance. Early solar cells were expensive and inefficient, used mainly in spacecraft where cost mattered less than reliability and where carrying fuel was impractical. But solar technology improved steadily. Efficiency increased. Costs dropped. By the 21st century, solar power became competitive with fossil fuels in many locations. Panels appeared on rooftops, in desert installations covering square miles, on satellites orbiting Earth. Solar power was clean, producing no pollution or emissions during operation. It was sustainable, drawing on sunlight that would shine whether we captured it or not. It was distributed, allowing individual buildings to generate their own power rather than depending entirely on distant power plants and vulnerable transmission lines. Solar cells represent energy democracy, power available to anyone in sunny locations, reducing dependence on centralized utilities and fossil fuel companies. They're the beginning of a transition to renewable energy, a recognition that our civilization's growth must eventually align with sustainable practices if we're to survive long-term. The solar cell catches light itself and turns it into power, as close to magic as technology gets, and it's becoming the foundation of our energy future. Yet as we developed new technologies and reached for space, we encountered new challenges. Space itself, seemingly empty, turns out to be filled with hazards. Micrometeoroids, tiny particles traveling at tremendous speeds, constantly bombard spacecraft. A particle smaller than a grain of sand, moving at several miles per second, carries enough kinetic energy to puncture spacecraft walls, damage equipment, kill astronauts. Space debris, fragments from old satellites and rockets, poses similar dangers. Without protection, operating in space for extended periods would be impossible. The Whipple shield, invented by Fred Whipple in 1947, provides elegant protection through a counterintuitive principle. Instead of one thick wall, a Whipple shield uses multiple thin layers separated by space. When a micrometeoroid strikes the outer layer, it vaporizes into a cloud of particles. These particles spread out and strike the inner layers with energy distributed across a larger area, preventing penetration. The spacing between layers is critical, allowing the impact cloud to disperse before striking subsequent barriers. Before Whipple shields, spacecraft armor would have needed to be impossibly thick and heavy to provide protection. With them, lightweight multi-layer structures could stop impacts that would pierce solid walls of the same total thickness. Whipple shields protect the International Space Station, satellites, and spacecraft, making long-duration space operations practical. They demonstrate a pattern common in advanced technology. Sometimes the solution to a problem isn't brute force but cleverness, understanding physics deeply enough to use it elegantly. And as humanity ventured into space and built global satellite networks, we needed ways for these spacecraft to communicate with Earth and with each other. Radio worked, but had limited bandwidth. What was needed was a communication system that could transmit vast amounts of data reliably. And the answer, as with so many modern technologies, was optical fiber, but adapted for space applications. We've spoken of optical fiber before, carrying data across continents through underground cables. But optical fiber also found crucial applications in satellites and spacecraft. Fiber optic cables are lightweight, immune to electromagnetic interference that plagues electronic systems in space, and can carry enormous amounts of data. Satellites use optical fiber internally to connect systems, to transmit data from instruments to transmitters. Ground stations use optical fiber to connect to satellite dishes and data centers. More remarkably, scientists developed free space optical communication, using lasers to transmit data between satellites or from satellites to ground stations without physical cables. Light beams carry data through the vacuum of space, faster and with more capacity than radio waves. This technology enables high-resolution Earth observation, allows satellites to relay enormous amounts of data, supports the global communication networks we depend on for everything from GPS to weather forecasting to internet connectivity in remote areas. Optical fiber and laser communication represent information flowing as light, as photons carrying data at light speed, whether through glass cables or through the vacuum of space. Their infrastructure for a connected world and a spacefaring future, invisible threads of light binding our civilization together and reaching out beyond our planet. From fuel cells promising clean energy to solar cells capturing sunlight, from Whipple shields protecting spacecraft to optical communications linking satellites, these technologies point toward humanity's future. They address the challenges of sustainability, of operating beyond Earth, of building a civilization that can thrive not just for years or decades, but for centuries and millennia. They represent thinking beyond immediate needs, planning for a future where humans might live and work in space, where our energy comes from renewable sources, where our impact on Earth is sustainable rather than destructive. These inventions aren't just about what we can do now, but about what becomes possible if we think carefully, plan wisely, and build for the long term. They're about extending human civilization into the future, about ensuring that all the progress we've made, all the innovations we've developed, can continue and flourish. Rest now, looking upward at the stars, knowing that the same ingenuity that brought us from caves to cities might someday carry us to those distant lights. Feel the sun's warmth on your face, energy from 93 million miles away, and know that we're learning to capture it, to use it, to build a future that works with nature rather than against it. And drift peacefully, knowing that our long journey is nearly complete. And so we arrive finally at today, at this moment, this quiet night, where you rest comfortably, surrounded by the accumulated innovations of 10,000 years of human creativity. It's easy to take for granted the world we inhabit, to forget how recently most of these marvels were impossible dreams. But look around, even with closed eyes, and feel how thoroughly these inventions have woven themselves into the fabric of daily existence. Consider the barcode, that simple pattern of black lines we barely notice anymore, printed on every product in every store. Each barcode is a bridge between physical objects and digital information, allowing global logistics networks to track millions of items moving across oceans and continents, arriving exactly where they're needed, exactly when they're needed. The shirt you're wearing traveled thousands of miles from factory to warehouse to store to your home, and barcodes tracked it every step of the way, invisibly coordinating the vast machinery of global commerce. The barcode made the world's supply chains possible, turned global trade into something reliable and precise, connected factory floors to checkout counters in an unbroken chain of information. And when you need to find your way, when you're lost or seeking directions, GPS satellites orbiting overhead know exactly where you are, can guide you anywhere you want to go. 20,000 miles above Earth, satellites broadcast signals that your phone catches and interprets, calculating your position to within meters. You never think about the complex orbital mechanics, the atomic clocks, the relativistic corrections needed to make GPS work. You simply expect to know where you are, and you do. GPS has made getting lost almost impossible, has enabled entire industries from ride-sharing to precision agriculture, has quietly become so fundamental to modern life that if it stopped working, much of our infrastructure would fail within hours. The internet connects billions of devices worldwide, an invisible web of communication carrying data at nearly light speed. Every email you send, every video you watch, every search you perform, travels as packets of data through this global network, routed intelligently through thousands of interconnected systems, arriving in seconds even when crossing oceans. The internet has changed how we work, how we communicate, how we shop and learn and entertain ourselves. It's made distance nearly irrelevant for information, created new forms of community and connection, enabled collaboration across continents, transformed commerce and creativity and human relationships in ways still unfolding. And layered atop the internet, the World Wide Web gives structure to information, makes knowledge accessible to anyone with a connection. The sum of human knowledge, millions of books, billions of documents, trillions of web pages, all searchable, all reachable with a few keystrokes. Questions that once required trips to libraries and hours of research can be answered in seconds. Learning is no longer limited by physical access to books or teachers. Information wants to be found, and the web ensures it can be. The democratization of knowledge is perhaps the web's greatest gift, the ending of information scarcity, the beginning of an age where ignorance is increasingly a choice rather than an inevitability. And beneath all of this, powering everything digital, are transistors, billions of them in every computer and phone, switching on and off millions of times per second, performing calculations, storing data, enabling the digital world. Transistors are invisible, buried in silicon chips, but they're the foundation of modern life. Without transistors, there are no computers, no smartphones, no internet, no digital anything. The transistor is the most important invention of the 20th century, the silent switch that made information processing possible at scales that enable everything we consider modern about our world. These 5 inventions, barcode, GPS, internet, World Wide Web, and transistor, when woven together with all the others we've explored tonight, from fire to fuel cells, from wheels to Whipple shields, from the plow to penicillin, create the world you inhabit. Not a perfect world, certainly. Technology has brought problems as well as solutions, created new challenges even as it solved old ones. But it's a world of unprecedented abundance, connection, capability, and length of life. You lie here now, comfortable and safe, in climate-controlled shelter, illuminated if you wish by electric light, connected to the entire world through devices that fit in your pocket, with access to food preserved and transported from across the globe, protected by medical knowledge that has doubled human lifespan, surrounded by materials and tools our ancestors couldn't have imagined. Every moment of your daily life is touched by hundreds of these inventions, working invisibly, reliably, taken for granted, because they work so well we forget they exist. This is the gift of all those inventors, thinkers, tinkerers, and dreamers across all those centuries. People who saw problems and imagined solutions, who experimented and failed and tried again, who built on the work of those before them, adding one small improvement at a time until the impossible became commonplace. From the first human who tended fire to the engineers designing spacecraft, from the anonymous inventor of the wheel to the scientists sequencing DNA, each contributed to the long arc of progress that brought us here. And the story isn't finished. Right now, somewhere, someone is working on the next innovation that will change the world. Perhaps it's a better battery that will finally make electric vehicles truly practical. Perhaps it's a medical breakthrough that will cure diseases we still cannot treat. Perhaps it's a material, or a machine, or an idea we cannot yet imagine. The pattern continues, the accumulated knowledge growing, each generation building on what came before, pushing forward, reaching higher. But for now, for tonight, rest easy in this world 10,000 years in the making. Let the weight of history settle comfortably around you like a warm blanket, woven from countless threads of human ingenuity. Feel grateful for the fire that warms, the light that illuminates, the medicine that heals, the connections that unite us. And as you drift into sleep, know that you are living in the culmination of humanity's long story of innovation, in a time of marvels that previous generations would have considered magic, in a world that, despite its imperfections, represents the very best of what humans can achieve when we apply creativity, persistence, and care to the challenges we face. Sleep now, peacefully, in this remarkable world we've built together. The journey through invention is complete, at least for tonight. Tomorrow will bring its own wonders, its own challenges, its own opportunities to add to the great story of human progress. But that is for tomorrow. Tonight, simply rest, surrounded by 10,000 years of human achievement, and let yourself dream of what might come next. Good night.